voice to this debate around forging stronger communities, because it's such a critical part of the journey. I would go further, actually, and say that the voluntary sector, with its very long and rich history in this country over centuries, has played a critical part to binding communities together. And that's what we currently do as well. And that's even more significant and important in the most difficult times, when communities are challenged in all sorts of ways. And here we are after a decade of austerity, and we all know the impact that has had, and we hope and pray that we're about to come out of it. Time will tell. But in that period, the most vulnerable have suffered the most. That's what usually happens in difficult times. And that's when the voluntary sector, in partnership with a whole range of other people, in the way that Izzy was describing, stands up and provides the support, the glue, that might just give people hope through those really difficult times. And I'm talking about, you know, the health sector, the housing challenges, the mental health crisis that we're facing in this country, the challenges that schools have in providing wraparound services beyond straightforward education. I say that as a former teacher, myself really understanding that world well. The services for older people and so on. And the voluntary sector plays a part addressing all of those challenges. But it's getting more and more difficult, and more of the same isn't going to suffice. So the partnership working that Izzy was just talking about, you know, thinking outside the box, the co-production of what the solution is the only way to be. I think we've all got to move away from any of the individual services, whether they're run by mayors or by local council leaders, or the private sector that dabbles in and out of providing services. Anybody thinking that they can solve the challenges that communities, the people that we exist to serve, face is mistaken. The only way is to develop an interdependence where we each understand how each other's shoes pinch, where we all let go of our individual silos, our boundaries that separate us, work together in an integrated way where we co-produce the solutions. And that could be a joint production of a range of providers from public, private, and voluntary sector coming together. Right at the core of that being the recognition that none of us can do this alone. And actually, our communities, the hundreds of thousands of young people that Bernardo supports every day, they don't really care about who's providing the support, but they want to know that it's going to be available when they need it, it's going to be of the quality that they need it, and it's going to be sustained for as long as they need it. And the voluntary sector is absolutely critical to that. The final message I'd give to everybody out there from local government is that don't think about the voluntary sector as an afterthought. Unfortunately, it's still happening far too often. Invite us in right at the start of when you're trying to identify the challenge that you're trying to solve. Involve us in trying to develop the solution, and then let's jointly deliver it.
Well, thank you, everybody. Before I come on to the questions on this very nifty app, Conservative Party conference app, that some of you I see are using, I just want to ask a quick question myself. I mean, I, at Policy Exchange, have done quite a lot of work on issues of integration and segregation of communities, and this is, in some parts of the country, a big issue. So my question is probably particularly an issue in many of our big metropolitan centres like Birmingham, and particularly the whole issue of school segregation, when having sort of mono-ethnic schools. And I just wonder, you know, whether, well, you, Andy, particularly, but anybody on the panel has any sort of ideas about what we do about that, and you know, whether it just has to be accepted as a fact of life.
So, in a perfect world, every school would be completely representative of the wider community that it serves. That, I'm afraid, is not going to happen. So I think some of our best schools actually do reflect that, and if you look at the results of some of our best schools, that's the case. But also, to be entirely fair, some of our schools where there is pretty much monoculture also perform incredibly well. So, and we do have this constantly as a challenge in Birmingham, and if we're very honest, we go back to the Trojan horse scandal of a few years ago, that was where this went wrong. So my answer to it is very clear. The school will naturally, because it serves a population, end up being pretty much dominated by one culture. But it has to operate within the guidance of what is the national curriculum, and all of the standards around British values and democracy and all of that have to be taught. And I have seen brilliant schools in the West Midlands where they are not as mixed as maybe we would like, where they actually deliver brilliant results and turn out brilliant citizens. But it is ensuring that that guidance is adhered to. And where we went wrong was when that guidance was not adhered to.
Anybody else want to comment on that? On this one?
Yeah, I'd go a bit further, actually, and just reframe the question. Because if we know that we've got communities and we've got schools and areas in the country that are not multicultural, they are monocultural, as you say, and thriving. But the question is, why is it? Why has it happened over these years, over the decades? Why have people felt that they need to congregate alongside in where they choose to live and where they choose to study with people who are similar to them? And it could be race, faith, culture, all kinds of different issues. And what is it about our society that makes it difficult for some people to feel confident about integration? And the challenge that I would put, and I say this as a former Brummie myself, went to inner city comprehensive in the heartlands of inner city Birmingham. In fact, one of the schools that since has been, dare I say, Trojan horsed. That's where I grew up, and it was monocultural. And what I saw through that upbringing of inner city Birmingham, and I see it in other parts of the country, and the young people that Bernardo's works with day in, day out, we hear this all the time, that people feel that they need greater support to feel confident as they're growing up in this fantastic country of ours. And not enough people are focused on them as individuals. Not enough people are focused on giving them the confidence to be who they are and display their difference, as opposed to a pressure to assimilate. And it's really quite complicated for young people to navigate that difficult terrain. Many of their parents and their grandparents are from grew up in a different time and place, from a different part of the country. And so all of that dynamic has to be understood to understand why people choose to congregate in particular ways. And let's not forget, expats from Britain who have congregated in other parts of the world have chosen to actually create their mini Englands in other parts. Just go to the Costa del Sol and parts of Spain, it is mini Britain out there. So it's not unusual for people to congregate amongst who they feel comfortable with.
Well, exactly. That is the point. That you might say it's even human nature for people to congregate together with people who they have a lot in common with, who they have cultural traditions in common with. But the point is, a good society is also one in which you have people moving across these boundaries of social class or ethnicity or whatever. And so how you get that balance, and clearly, many people think that we haven't been getting the balance right in many parts of the country. And I think it's sort of, I don't see where this assimilationist pressure is coming from. If anything, surely it's the opposite. People are constantly being told to celebrate their diversity. I see if anything, I see insufficient pressure for integration. But one policy idea that is sometimes talked about is the idea that local authorities of various kinds should publish data. Every 2 or 3 years, people should have to publish data on how mixed their neighbourhoods are, how mixed their schools are. And that would be a great pressure. Nobody wants to be the most segregated local authority in the country. That would act as a kind of pressure on people. Possibly an unfair one on certain councils. But
I kind of get that. I do understand that challenge and that pressure. But actually, it's people and parents who make choices about what's most convenient for them. In my particular authority, we're pretty big geographical spread, and actually they're going to end up going to the school that's closest to them. Our budgets are challenged by affording to support people to get to their nearest school, and we can't necessarily support outside of that. And I think everyone is in the same boat in local authority. We've ended up with just a few elements of education in our own local authorities, and that's around admissions, transport and special needs. There is little choice for us in how we assimilate that. But I do believe in individual people making choices. What I also believe in is people respecting and valuing the broad society that we are, and the richness that can help.
Right. Quick one, Ben, and then we need to go to the
I take a slightly different slant on this in a way from my view, especially being a mayor in the northeast of England, that you're only as well off as your least well-off member of your community. And we have a large Pakistani community in Middlesbrough, but actually my region is pretty monocultural. We actually have a greater issue about integration of socioeconomic backgrounds. Actually, some people may have seen a documentary that was on, I think, Panorama, that showed that my area, within a 15-mile distance, has the largest disparity of economic wealth than anywhere else in the country. We've got huge swathes of very wealthy, very well-off communities, but we have some of the most deprived in the country. And you then get the ghettoization of socioeconomic areas where schools go into a terminal decline because there is that lack of integration. There's also a lack of thinking about how you tackle that type of segregation separate to those that have already been discussed.
Yeah, I think our regional income disparities in this country are twice those of France, which is something to consider. Anyway, time to come to the app and to your questions. The first one that has the highest number of votes, so I'm going to be scrupulously fair about this, is also a very simple one. And actually, I might add an addendum to it. How can councils support our local high streets? And I want to add, how can councils support our local media to help create and support local identities? Who wants to go on that? High streets and media.
I'll make a start on that. The high streets have changed. The way we shop these days has changed. You know, we have our facilities in our hands, and certainly my daughter, my son, you know, they buy online. We're not going to stop that. What we have to do is make our high streets live. And I would say that that's going to be about the experience, the offer that the society can be provided. It might be about eating, it might be about a greater offer for mums with children and how can they entertain them and give them opportunities. They are going to look different, and we have always evolved, and that is the nature of our society. What we're not going to do is be able to stop the technological revolution and the way people are shopping. So propping up shops is going to be a difficulty. I think there really is something we should do, which is around business rates, which ought to be addressed, because there is a huge differential between those who are providing online services and those who are out there paying business rates on shops in the high street. And I think we have to change that.
It's an interesting devolution argument, actually. One of the conversations we're having is not just high streets, but how do we support local businesses? What control can we affect locally? And one of those is around taxation. And invariably, when you speak to Treasury officials in particular, they want to give us precepts and levies on business rates and transport levies and council tax levies. But as soon as you approach the subject of, well, if we can put 3% on local council tax, does that also come with the power to reduce it by 3%? And the answer there comes none. So actually, we have limited number of roles that we can play locally because it's largely around taxation policy and business rates of our high streets. The one thing I would warn against local councils in particular trying to preserve what the high streets of yesteryear used to be, because we're never going to get back there because of change of consumer behaviour. Consumers want something different. Just very, very quickly on the media aspect, it's interesting. I do think local leaders, council leaders and metro mayors can play a huge role in helping to solidify local identity. And I think that's one of the key reasons why when George Osborne introduced the metro mayor system, it was with a requirement to have a directly elected mayor, because there was a focal point and a figurehead that a community and a region could coalesce around. And I always thought it would work to some extent, but I've been pleasantly surprised to the extent with which people do look to that person to be the voice and community voice for that region. And a great example of that in very tragic circumstances was Andy Burnham after the bombings in Manchester. Within, I think, 2 or 3 weeks after being elected, was seen as that voice of Manchester and the greater area, and he did an amazing job in bringing the community together, something that wouldn't have been there had that position not been created.
Andy?
So to the question, the answer's lots, frankly. I mean, we all know high streets are changing, and there is an enormous role for councils to, as Ben said, not try to resist that change, but frankly enable us to get to a new good place. So just a few ideas, and we're trying to work through these in our West Midlands High Streets Task Force around this. So first of all, using the CPO powers that local authorities have to deal with derelict buildings, possibly turning them into homes. The explosion of residential living in city centres has been enormous, but middle-sized towns we've not tended to get to it, so an enormous opportunity there. Then there's a question of what can be done maybe about start-up business incubators, using derelict shops for that. We've seen some brilliant examples of that. Local authorities can hasten that. Then there's the whole question about what they do about parking charges, needs to be minimised. We've seen 2 great councils in the West Midlands, Dudley and Walsall, all but eliminate car parking charges in town centres. Makes a real difference. And then there's all the stuff about public realm, and of course councils can also foster lots of activities like markets, street fairs, whatever, to bring a sense of occasion to town centres. So actually there's an enormous role that the local authority can play to enable private sector development then to come and rejuvenate our towns. On the media question, interesting, because, you know, we think of media as printed media, but I think that is something of yesteryear. And what we're definitely seeing, again, nationwide, but I've got lots of examples from the West Midlands, is where new community media organisations are setting up, maybe really influential bloggers, and they're almost like the diarist of what's going on in town centres and can drive activity in. So enormous role for genuinely local media to cherish our town centres.
Yeah, the high street really matters to Barnardo's as well. People may not know we're one of the highest, we're one of the largest retailers on the high street. We have over 710 Barnardo's stores across the country. And so this whole issue really matters to us as well. You know, the decline of the high street and footfall is dropping and so on. And what I'd like to see from council leaders is to think much more multi-agency in terms of what we do with our spaces. So in Barnardo's, for example, we'd like the retail store that we're running, you know, trying to provide cheaper retail clothing for local residents, but to make it multifunctional. So, you know, if you're looking for a new place for a smaller version of a library or a community place for people to meet or an advice centre, let's bring these services together alongside the traditional retail outlets.
What about subsidising pubs that are going out of business? I mean, I think, you know, several hundred close every week, I've read somewhere. I mean, and they're often really important, particularly perhaps for older people, they're really important centres of community. I mean, is that too unconservative a thing to do, to subsidise the continuing existence of a pub? Anyone have any views on that?
A one-word answer? Yes. I mean, the general point here is you can't buck the market. No. And that, I mean, let's be honest, some pubs are going out of business, but they're also incredibly successful community-based pubs, real ale pubs. Wetherspoons is an incredible regeneration. They tend to be for younger people, though, don't they? I mean, not necessarily, no. But the principle stands. The local authority should not be subsidising individual businesses.
And my belief around that, I completely agree with Andy, and it is not for local authorities to subsidise businesses. You know, per se, because where do you stop and where do you start? And there is a reason why businesses by pubs are probably failing, because the footfall stops. And it's a little bit like, you know, buses in rural areas. Unless you get people using these buses and using the transport facilities, we will not be able to keep them going. It is choice.
Okay, let me move on to another question. Okay, so what more can local leaders do to attract big businesses out of London to their areas?
Do you want me to start?
Well, why not?
So, again, the answer is a huge amount. I maybe will tell a story which I think will help in this, because probably one of the most high-profile relocations recently has been HSBC, moving their retail bank headquarters from Canary Wharf to Birmingham. Now, who'd have thought a bank would move its headquarters from Canary Wharf? And it's fascinating to understand why they chose to come and then what they have discovered. It was not because we gave a subsidy on the rent or anything like that. It was actually for 3 reasons. The first was they believed that they could get the workforce that they needed. And of course, this is a head office workforce, well-paid jobs. Can a regional city offer what London provides? And they will say categorically that we did. So the critical thing is the skills development to enable you to attract these outstanding business. The second thing was all about the things that the workforce would enjoy. So it was about schools, green spaces, great cultural attractions, and that human story was actually more important than almost anything else. And the third thing was connectivity to markets. Now, I know that's a lot easier if you're in Birmingham than some other places, but that's, again, what HSBC was really after. Can our customers interact with us either virtually or obviously physically? So it was about those things which you work on in your economic plans rather than a particular deal for the subsidy for a relocation.
I think as well, it is also, what we find in our area, it's also about those specific projects, because as Andy alluded to in his opening remarks, if people want to invest in the northeast of England, who do they speak to? And they're looking for that leader and that person to be able to pick up the phone to sit across the table with and say, is there a deal to be done? Can we have a conversation about access to labour, land costs? Can we have a conversation about transport links? And especially to international investment, which is a large part of what we have as a branch economy in the northeast, big investors from North America and the Far East, they are used to going somewhere, acting business to business, in effect CEO to CEO, to try and do a deal. And they need to know that they have the political buy-in before they move to those next phases. And let's be honest, Teesside wasn't on the map for large parts of this until there was a directly elected mayor that they felt like they could go and have that conversation with. And we're seeing, as I alluded to in my open remarks, the work we've done with Equinor and SSE around making sure that we did all we could to support them around the CFD auction, which has resulted in now a Dogger Bank, a £9 billion project where manufacturing in the northeast is going to play the central role in offshore wind. That wouldn't happen unless you're able to interact on an effective senior management level to make sure that you soften and finesse the way into central government. Central government can often be quite harsh the way that it deals with individual
most
businesses.
of those companies are foreign owned. And is that an issue or not? I mean, most of the wind power companies are they're owned by the Dutch and the Danes and people, aren't they?
So it also depends on which part. So you've got the licenses for the sites themselves, which are largely dominated in this CFD round, like the likes of SSE and Equinor. You then have the tier one suppliers, which are who are manufacturing the things. And the government have a great Stexter deal around 60% UK content for offshore wind. I think it's a great industrial strategy proposition, but they've achieved it by accident, because one of the things with offshore wind is that part of the CFD auction was that 60% UK content, and if you don't have that, you get penalised in the auction. However, if everybody is supplying it from abroad and everybody gets penalised, then nobody's penalised. And actually, that's where we've been able to work very effectively with BEIS and DIT to show that there is a proposition in the northeast, a large area where manufacturing can occur. And we're now speaking to all of the largest offshore wind manufacturers who are now aware of us, working effectively with DIT and central government, who point them in our direction, because there is a more joined-up approach. And that's not just directly with the companies, it's also educating government departments about the propositions in the regions that they wouldn't have otherwise known about had these types of organisations not existed. And I mean, I'm sure there are councils doing some fantastic things, but it's often because of the financial situation councils are under at the moment, they don't necessarily have the resource and the ability to spend that time being as outward-facing and as focused as we can, because our focus is much more narrow than a normal council.
Let me just go to another very simple, straightforward question. Should more transport policy be devolved to the regions?
Well, Andy definitely would say yes.
Yes. I mean, do you want?
I think we'd all say yes.
Yeah, we all would. Yes.
I suppose, yeah, that's a
Very
simple one. Okay, well, I can't resist this one. This is a rather self-interested one because it uses a couple of terms that I invented. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Road to Somewhere, in which I talked about the value divides in our society that had led to Brexit and Trump and populism and so on. I talked about the people who see the world from anywhere and the people who see the world from somewhere, the anywheres being generally highly educated, mobile, liberally minded people, the somewheres being much more rooted, less well educated, people who care about security and familiarity. So there are 5 votes for this question. I'm not just pushing it up the list. But somebody has asked, is the Conservative Party switching from being the party of anywheres to being the party of somewheres?
I think it is. And I think it's largely in very recent times because of Boris. You know, Boris having been, as you alluded to in your opening remarks, that he was a mayor of somewhere and an area that required practical solutions rather than necessary abstract solutions. Actually understanding what local communities need and how you can affect change in a specific area. We've seen it with policies on bus devolution, conversations on regional train devolution and rail devolution. Right. And actually the very frank conversation that the Prime Minister had with myself and the other northern mayors was that you know, it's great that you're able to do things with these powers and this money, but you need more responsibility, because and that comes with additional powers. And I think looking outside of our major cities, one of the things that massively frustrates me, and it has done ever since I got this fortunate enough to get this job, is that when people look to the north of England, there's a lazy stereotype that they just go to Manchester. And the north of England is so much more than Manchester. Yeah. It's so much more than our northern city. It's the great towns of Blackburn, Blackpool, Middlesbrough, Gateshead. I mean, it's all of those places. And actually, I think you will see over the coming weeks, the Conservative Party focus much, much more on our towns rather than the metropolitan cities, which is often the focus of political policy.
Although, of course, Boris did also come to Manchester, I think his second day as Prime Minister, was it? And he said in that speech, you know, I recognise the Brexit vote was as much a vote against London as it was against Brussels.
It absolutely was.
And for me, absolutely, of course, it's about the somewhere. It's about why can I not make my place the best place for people to live, work, and to grow their family. And you know, life is a competition. Life is about being the best about it, offering that to your population and to your citizens, that sense of invested pride in the area that they live, and they're wanting to support their networks that help them to create that. I think it's really important, because that's actually what we're about in Britain.
So I really hope the answer is yes. Yeah. The Conservative Party is for somewheres. I mean, I think, you know, we've heard lots of statements and promises about how the future is going to be different. Fundamentally, I think any political party in this country that doesn't recognize the danger of creating postcode lotteries for public service is in danger of losing its connection with what the public want. It shouldn't matter where you live. There should be a minimum standard, a universal service offer, particularly for the most vulnerable who rely on the state. Beyond that, you can have local flex, you know, the mayors and the council leaders and so on can put their local flavor depending on their populations and their particular needs, but the minimum standard should be available everywhere. It shouldn't be based on this lottery of where you happen to be born.
Right, yeah. Although, of course, one of the you know, we talk a lot about social mobility, and one of the sort of problems with our social geography in this country is that, you know, every year, all the brightest 18-year-olds from many of the most depressed parts of the country leave, you know, Mansfield or Rotherham, and go to a residential university and never come home, or at least never come home permanently. So, you know, the stress on social mobility via higher education is exacerbating, you might say, the social divisions in our country.
And I think that it is fundamentally about how you shape the offer in your community, how you build the skills, and what that skills offer is going to be to the business sector that, you know, arguably the mayors. I personally, you know, we've got two mayors sitting here, but I believe that we can still do that in the rurality areas where I live. I believe that we have to drive for economy and for growth, and that has to be based on skills and what the offer is in that area.
Let's go, because we've got to wind up, I think, in a couple of minutes. So let me go to a final question, which is a nice big general one again, but perhaps brings us back to decision-making systems, and it is this. How can we strengthen localism and local decision-making post-Brexit? 2 minutes from each of you.
Do you want me to go first?
Well, no, you can go last, Andy,
right.
actually. Well, let's do it in reverse order.
So I think one of the big weaknesses of the localism agenda so far has been not enough focus on what young people want. We've got to find really creative ways of engaging with their voice, and young people want that voice, are demanding it. They're not all going to be Greta Thunbergs, of course, really national movements, but there are local people, and Bernardo's works with them all the time. There is a trust deficit at the moment. We recently did a survey of young people where 67% of those young people said that they had no confidence in the future. 62% said that the government doesn't care enough about them and cares about older people. Right? A lot of them don't have a vote, of course, but today's young people are the ones going to be traveling on tomorrow's transport systems. Today's young people are going to have very different lifestyles to the ones we've had, different work patterns and so on. So as we develop policy, national or local, let's focus on the young people's voice too, please.
Yeah. I think we need to celebrate leaders. We really need to build leadership in wider areas possible. It's so important because it's leadership and it's partnership that will help to shape our places in the future. We in local authorities deal with every sector of society, from children to working age to our retired. It's absolutely essential that we listen to them, help shape those communities, and build a sense of pride and a sense of purpose in our communities. And that comes from leadership.
I'm going to concentrate on what I think is a fairly boring point, actually, and it's the strength of the organisations as they exist. A great example, Boris wants to level up all the powers to all the regional mayors, for instance. However, you know, if one of the things that isn't being devolved at the moment is health, I wouldn't want to touch health, because if government decided to give me health tomorrow, the whole system would fall over because of the lack of maturity of the organisation. So what this is a journey, and it's about earned autonomy. It's about the organisation showing that it's growing, it's mature enough to take on more responsibility, and that's where you've got to work more with central government and local partners to show and prove that actually you can take that responsibility. Because if it all goes wrong, because government all of a sudden say, right, just take all the decisions locally, it's an easy thing to say, but when it falls over in 2 weeks' time, it's the government's going to get the backlash. So it's a balance of speed and when you deliver it rather than if you just deliver it.
Final word, Andy.
Okay, final word. So I'm going to answer your question in a sense by going back to the anywhere and somewhere, because you didn't give me an opportunity to answer that. So, and I'm going to say something slightly different to my colleagues, because the answer is it's got to be both on those things. And in a sense, the post-Brexit opportunity has got to enable us to do that. So, of course, there's got to be a move to the somewhere, and that is actually what Theresa May's government also realised after 2016. If you think of the banners around our conferences, it was all about an economy that works for everywhere, every place, and that's indeed why devolution has been set up and why we're sitting here. But what we mustn't lose is Britain's leadership on the anywhere piece as well, because we mustn't underestimate how substantial and wonderful that has made this country in the eyes of the rest of the world. And a flip from one to the other would be entirely wrong. Now then, so what then has to happen in terms of practical things post-Brexit? There's all the stuff about continuing devolution, where the cash flow goes, but I want to put one other thing on the table as well. We've actually got to think about how our politics as well, you said it was a vote against London, it was also a vote against our political structures. So one thing I am very, very keen to see is we have a much more, and you might say this is fanciful, but we're trying to do it on the ground, a much more inclusive approach to politics. So it's definitely bringing the business community in, it's definitely bringing the academic community in, it's trying to find consensus rather than constantly finding the divisions in society. And it's also, as others have said, trying to do this in partnership, and there is absolutely, as both as Izzy said particularly, this whole notion of bringing youth, community groups in together. And that's the challenge for the politicians, to change the framework from one of adversarial work to one of collaborative work.
Well, thank you, Andy. And, well, thank you. I mean, local government can be a pretty dry subject, but I think we've managed to inject a bit of interest in it in the last 45 minutes. All of life was there. So can you say thank you in the usual way to our panel? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lord Michael Dodds, who'll be in conversation with Ian Dale.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. At the moment, it's just me, not Michael Dodds, but he will be here in a second. And what we're going to do over the course of the next 35 minutes or so is Michael was going to make a short speech, then I'm going to be in conversation with him, and then we'll take some questions from you. But if you can submit the questions via the Conservative Party app, which I'm sure you've all got on your phones, and if you are looking at your phones doing this, I won't think that you're bored, I'll just think that you're asking questions. He's a fascinating character. As you know, he was the creator of House of Cards, but he's got a real history in the Conservative Party. He was Chief of Staff to Norman Tebbit in the late 1980s, and then left politics to start writing novels. And what a successful career he's had. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Dobbs. Well, there he is. The late Michael Dobbs.
Yes.
Good to see you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ian. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Manchester. It's great to be here with you. But they've asked me to talk about politics and writing. Political fiction, you know. It's the easy stuff. You just take reality and then you water it down. You have to make it credible. But then, at times, it's not that easy. A little while ago, I was in a bookshop in Bournemouth, and a little old lady rushed over to me and said, I've always wanted to meet you and tell you that I read 1 or 2 pages of your book before I fall fast asleep at night. I hope I have a little bit more luck with you. Many years ago, so many years ago that I must have been young, I worked for a lady called Margaret Thatcher. You may remember her. She was the woman that President Chirac described as having the lips of Marilyn Monroe and the eyes of Caligula. So I guess it was always going to be a bit of a bumpy ride. I was her chief of staff. Now, Norman Tebbit told me what that meant. He said that there comes a time in every war when those in charge required that someone be taken out into a courtyard, be put up against a wall, and shot. My job was to find the body until the time came when I would be that body. Well, Maggie and me, we had more than 10 extraordinary years as I worked for her. I was the first person on election night in 1979 to be able to turn to her and tell her, "Congratulations, you're Prime Minister." "We shall see," she said, "we shall see." And by goodness, we did. But we fell out in the end, Maggie and me. I got a right old handbagging. It happens. But that doesn't stop me from regarding her as being the greatest peacetime Prime Minister that this country had during the 20th century. We had a falling out, so what? Well, so what? I went off to a little Mediterranean island of Gozo to recuperate, and I decided it was time to look for another job. Well, Maggie rather insisted. So one morning I sat down beside the swimming pool with a pad and a pen and a bottle of wine to see if I could write. And by the time I had finished that bottle of wine, I had scribbled on my writing pad just 2 initials. F-U. Now, clearly I should have been in therapy. But as the holiday went on, F.U. became a chap called Francis Urquhart. And F.U. became his character. And the book was called House of Cards. John Major was kind enough to say that it had done for his job what Dracula had done for babysitting. And the book transformed my life. And I owe it all to being beaten up by Maggie. Then we made an American version with President Frank Underwood. I called him FU2. And it all became rather popular. Italy's Prime Minister Renzi was photographed going into a bookshop and purchasing a copy. So I thought I should write to him. Sir, I said, I hope that you will enjoy my book, but please remember that it's a work of entertainment, not a work of instruction. And a few years ago, President Xi of China came to Britain on a state visit, and I was invited to meet him. Now, House of Cards has millions of followers in China. I think they see it as a documentary. So I decided to present him with an original hardback copy of the book, now more than 30 years old. When I gave the book to him, his eyes lit up in gratitude. Then he saw what it was, and he frowned. "What?" he said. "You have House of Cards in this country too?" Well, I'm very happy to say that House of Cards is a huge hit in China. So is Mr. Bean and Downton Abbey and many other wonderful British ideas. And just think about what that means. At the touch of a button, we can send our message, our culture, our values, our stories, our brands around the globe. The world is shrinking. It's getting smaller. We have the ability today to share our values, our ideas, our goods and services in a way we simply couldn't have imagined 20 years ago. That's a hugely exciting prospect for global Britain. What isn't shrinking, growing smaller, of course, is the row about political language. This one is about as balmy as you can get. Now, as a writer, you hopefully develop some feel for language and a sense of the meaning of words. But it doesn't really require much sense at all to know that the accusations that Boris is inciting violence are really, really silly. It's not the Conservative Party hanging effigies from the bridges. Now, the object of this particular exercise is very clear. It's to beat up on Boris and hope that he will buckle. In just the same way as so many attending our conferences these past years have been spat at, sworn at, shouted down, and politically intimidated. Try being a Tory on a university campus and you'll soon see what I mean. But they have made a terrible mistake because Boris and we are made of sterner stuff. And I tell you something, when it comes to insults, I cannot think of anything more insulting than to call 17.4 million people stupid, ignorant, ill-informed, bigots, racist. How dare they? Mind you, these are the same people who are threatening to abolish private schools just as soon as their children have finished their education. You couldn't make this stuff up. Being a classic liberal used to be about fair play, about rights and responsibilities, about balancing freedoms. It was a badge of pride. Sadly, being a liberal today has become an excuse for little but arrogance and intolerance. I was reading about Winston Churchill over the summer. It's something that Boris and I have in common. We've both written books about Churchill, although I should modestly admit that I've written rather more than he has. 4 novels, a television play, and I hope more to come. But Boris, he's a young man, filled with ambition. I'm sure he'll catch up eventually. But my reading reminded me of so many similarities between then and now. For instance, how bitterly they opposed Winston in the 1930s. The establishment, I mean. During those crucial years, the establishment got almost everything that was important wrong. Horribly wrong. Promised peace with honor. Peace in our time. Embraced appeasement, claimed it was the moral option, and accused Winston of being a warmonger. Yes, of inciting violence. Any of this sound familiar? They accused him of inappropriate language. Winston Churchill, at one stage, he was even howled into silence in the House of Commons. They refused to listen to him. But fortunately, Winston found a way forward. He trusted the people, not the establishment, but the common sense of the people. In his first speech as Prime Minister, while many in the establishment expected and some even wanted him to fail, he said, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." Brutal honesty. He trusted the people with the truth. That's why he overcame and why we won. And if it was good enough for Winston, well, food for thought, perhaps, for today. But you know, politics isn't just about policies. Politics is about dreams, just as writing so often is. But sometimes I worry. What dreams do the young have? And not enough, I would suggest. And perhaps that's not so surprising. Think about it. If you're 25, you are the future. You're the country's future. You are our future. But what sort of past have you been given? Your first political memory was probably the bombing of the Twin Towers. After that, years of war upon war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria. And if that wasn't enough, we then threw the mother and father of financial crises at you. Now, I could, of course, blame so much of that on the liberal establishment, but that's not the point I want to make here. It's that in looking beyond Brexit, we must find ways of raising their sights and refocusing their energies, restore their hope, give them the opportunity to climb the mountain, to take those risks, and to see the glorious view from the summit. Because Brexit is all about tomorrow. That's why I get so excited about what lies ahead. I'm an optimist. I have to be. I've got 4 kids. That's why I've had to write so many books. And I'm an optimist because I have faith in our people and our country. Brexiteers are optimists. We are also realists, and we are winners. I want to end this talk before I get to the wonderful Ian and his interrogation. I want to end this talk in the arms of Lady Astor, the first woman to sit in the House of Commons. She was a Conservative, of course. Dear Nancy, it's no great secret that Nancy Astor and Winston didn't really get on. They fought like ferrets in a sack their entire career. She once turned to him and said, "Winston, if you were my husband, I would poison your coffee." He turned to her and said, "Madam, if you were my wife, I would drink it." But there was a time that they were going side by side into the Guildhall in the City of London together. And she said, "Winston, look around you. You could fill half of this great hall with all the brandy that you've drunk in your life." The old man looked around him and said, "Just half?" he said. There's so much more still to do and so little time to do it. That's good advice. My friends, we are facing what is nothing less than a march with destiny, a fight for the future of our country, a fight to reaffirm the simple idea that in the end it's the people who decide. And that's why we must carry on fighting to deliver the Brexit they voted for. Yes, yes, there is so much more still to do, so little time to do it. So, thank you. Thank you for what you have done already, and thank you for what I know you will be doing so willingly in the days ahead. And thank you for listening. May your dreams go with you.
Now, do you realise, Michael, you're responsible for spreading fake news in what you said there?
Oh, I do hope so. I really want to...
It wasn't Jacques Chirac who said that about Margaret Thatcher, about the eyes of Caligula and the mouth of Marilyn Monroe. It was President Mitterrand.
Of course, of course.
Had to catch you out on something. Now, let's talk a little bit...
I had Chirac in my mind, of course, because he parted.
He did, indeed.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about your book writing, because you haven't written a book for some time now, and your fans are eager for another one. And you dropped a little hint there that the next one might feature Winston Churchill, because you wrote this wonderful series of what I call faction, where you mixed fact and fiction, which for the reader was quite difficult to discern which was which.
I often can't, as you know, can't tell often which is which. But the reason I haven't written a book is because I've been busy in the House of Lords, and you know, Parliament gets very distracting. A wonderful place, that gingerbread palace on the river. It's a place of lots of hard work, but also, may I say, trials and executions and assassinations, and even the execution of Guy Fawkes. You know Guy Fawkes, the only man, it is said, ever to enter the Parliament building with an honest intent. But I've been working, it has got distracting. I keep telling my wife, look, next year I'm going to spend more time doing what I really love, which is writing. That's what I want to have on my gravestone. Not that I was a political hack, but that I was a writing hack. But for some reason, we get Brexit and we get elections and it goes on and on and on.
But have you decided what kind of book you're going to write?
Yeah, I'm writing about 3 or 4 or 5 different television scripts at the moment.
Okay.
So not so much books, but television scripts. Some based on Winston. I'd love to write a play about Winston Churchill, because I think that he speaks across the years so wonderfully well. Do you remember that wonderful film, Darkest Hour, that Gary Oldman of all people, played a fantastic Winston Churchill. And it just shows how nowadays, with all the modern technology and the new techniques we have, how we can really get a creative message home.
Do you enjoy the TV side just as much as writing novels? Because obviously House of Cards, the original House of Cards, was turned into a TV drama, then followed by two of your other books. And now, of course, there's a huge success of House of Cards in the United States. Do you get a kick out of that? Or is it, obviously you get a lot of money out of it?
I've got 4 kids, what do you want? No, writing books is very different from writing television and film. Writing a book, you traditionally, you lock yourself away in your attic and you spend hour after hour, day after day, remorselessly producing the script. It's very hard, it's very physically and emotionally draining, and it's very isolating. Some people say being a writer of books is a very lonely job. I don't find it lonely because you're there with your characters. But it is isolating, and in all honesty, I do find I'm a different person because I'm under such pressure in a different world. Television work is very much simpler. It's very much more collaborative. You lose control, of course, because it is part of a team effort, and other people are going to have to tell you and advise you what it is you're going to do. But actually, I love the back and forth of it all.
But it must have been quite difficult when the Americans were sort of writing I say they were writing the script, I don't know what input you had in that, but you must have felt that you had lost control of the characters because they were creating completely different characters, okay, based on your original. But was that a frustrating process?
No, it's like watching your children grow up. You know, you can't control the process, it happens, but you sit back and look at it with a sense of awe, almost. And after all, I can't be too precious about it because, I mean, I stole it from others, the whole idea. I remember as a kid, at the age of, I think it was about 13, I was approaching O-levels, as we used to have in those days, and the teacher threw at me, Shakespeare. I thought, oh, goodness, Shakespeare. Julius Caesar. And I started reading, and it was this fabulous story about the most powerful man in the world who got hacked and chopped and stabbed to death on the steps of his own Capitol building by his best mates, who then went off and killed each other. And as a 13-year-old, I thought this was fabulous. And I think that's probably what inspired most of House of Cards.
If you were writing a modern-day House of Cards, bear in mind it was, 1990 when it came out initially, who do you think in modern-day politics is most like Francis Urquhart?
Oh.
I have my own views on that.
We shall see. Now, it depends which part of Francis Urquhart, because remember Francis Urquhart came to a sticky end, and a deserved sticky end. I would, well, politics isn't quite what it used to be. I would hope that there's a bit of Francis Urquhart in all good Tories, because actually politics is a
Which
rough...
bit?
Politics is a rough, tough business. It's not a nice, gentle, cuddly business. It's where you're fighting with passion for what it is you believe in. So don't give me this idea that everybody should conciliate and compromise. No, you stand and fight for what you believe in, politely but persistently. And so I hope that, like Renzi, I hope they don't take House of Cards as a book of instruction. But what really matters in politics to me is that politicians believe in something. And if I can offer one criticism about Francis Urquhart, it seems to me that he believed in nothing but power. And that's never enough. Because what are you going to leave behind you when your political career comes to an end? Power is meaningless unless you use it for a purpose.
To introduce a note of controversy, that is what people accuse Boris Johnson of, that he only ever wanted to be Prime Minister, used Brexit as a means to get there, and doesn't really believe in anything.
Boris, my dear, is delivering Brexit in a way that nobody else has even tried. And that is why I am full of optimism, because his resilience... and his eloquence will get us through. And that is why they are trying so hard to shout him down, to destroy him, because they know that he threatens everything they stand for, which is yesterday. It's that old liberal media establishment where they tell us what it is we should be doing. That's why they're so happy with Brussels. And I don't want to say too unpleasant things about Brussels, simply to say that we have a right to decide to do things differently. That's what the people decided, and that is what Boris will deliver.
Do you think that people of our generation suffer from a bit of sort of old Gittism, where we think, well, of course, the politicians today, they're not like they were in the 1980s. Whereas I have a theory that the politicians, the public of the 1980s said, well, of course, they're not like the politicians of the 1960s. And this is very sort of a circular thing. Or do you actually look at politicians now and think, well, generally, they don't really believe anything, and they're the least impressive bunch of politicians that I've ever seen?
No, I don't quite accept that. I mean, politics has always been difficult, and it's always been impolite. I mean, I don't quite remember Hogarth, but I've seen his etchings of what politics used to be like. Somebody, 100 years ago, even threw a copy of a book across the chamber at Winston Churchill.
Wasn't John McDonnell, was it?
No. But one of the things that has changed today, it seems to me, is the difficulty that politicians have in stepping back from affairs in order to think about them, in order to put them in perspective. We now have 24-hour news, social media, and constantly their nose is held at the grindstone. I don't think that's particularly healthy. I don't happen to think that there is much of social media that is particularly healthy. I think that's a real concern for the next 10, 15 years. How do we take all the wonderful bits of social media and use them and exploit them without suffering from the really difficult parts of social media that are beginning to emerge? For instance, you know, the last 10, 15 years, the use of social media amongst young children, people has gone up like that. And the incidence of self-harm amongst young people has gone up like that. And the incidence of suicide amongst young people has gone up like that. I cannot but believe there is some connection, and we need to understand it, and we need to use social media, not social media use us.
I'm trying to imagine Harold Macmillan in an age of social media, where he, as Prime Minister, used to spend the afternoon reading a bit of Trollope.
And that wasn't because he was being idle or lazy, or because his wife was off with Bob Boothby. It was because he found that his means of getting reflection on the events of the day.
But modern-day Prime Ministers don't have that luxury, do they?
That's a problem. That is a problem. It's something...
Donald Trump has executive time. Apparently Donald Trump has 2 meetings a day, and that's it. And the rest of the time, he has executive time where he just spends his time doing what he wants.
What it seems to me about Boris is that Boris, when he was Mayor of London, and a hugely successful Mayor of London, got around him a team of excellent people, not all of them Conservatives, but mostly Conservatives, of course, and then trusted them to get on with the job that he had given them. He gave them the instructions, they went and did it. And I see the cabinet right now as being very much in that same mould, as being a group of very capable people who I think Boris will trust to get on with that job while he does the strategy, the big stuff, gets Brexit through. And I think there's a very healthy balance.
Right, let's go to some questions on the app. You can still submit questions if you'd like to. They'll immediately come up on my screen here. The most popular one so far: how would Frank Underwood approach Brexit?
Oh dear, how would Frank Underwood approach Brexit? He's rather fortunate, of course, because he can't simply call an election. Look, history's going to say one of the big problems about Brexit is that we called an election in 2000, the last election, at the very wrong time. And we got it wrong. Now, that is something that Frank Underwood could not do. What he would do is he would gather around us. I'm making this up as I go along, but then as a writer, I'm allowed to, aren't I? I think that what he would do is he would make sure that people understood where he stood and put as much pressure on those who opposed him to be honest about what it is they really wanted. And it's quite clear that there are many genuine Remainers who have issues with the way that we are pursuing Brexit. But there are many people on the Remain side who simply don't want Brexit at all and are trying to stop it. There is no doubt about that. And I think that we have to expose that time and again. And it is ironic, isn't it, that those who keep shouting order, order, just leave behind them chaos, chaos.
So you don't think there would have been a scene where Frank Underwood pushes Michel Barnier off a train platform at all in front of a train?
I think President Juncker might end up just simply falling onto the tracks himself.
If you're watching, Mr. Juncker.
Has trouble with his back, yes.
Which one should we go to next? How do you do your research, someone wants to know? Is this the sort of thing where you, when you write I suppose the Winston Churchill trilogy, you had to do a lot of research, but whereas parliamentary ones, I suppose you can do it from instinct or experience.
Why do I write novels about Winston Churchill? What do novels have to do with anything? Well, actually, I think they have quite a lot to do with things, because novels can fill in the gaps that history inevitably leads. Winston himself said history was had a flickering lamp which stumbled along the pathways of the past. He knew that even his own histories weren't perfect. And what I like to do is to get inside the character. I wanted to get inside the character of Winston Churchill and then look at what it is he did. Work from the inside out rather than from the outside in, which is what most historians do. And for that, you know, I talked to many people who had worked for him. They were still alive then. I've been doing this for quite some time. Many of his staff, really personal staff, his nurses, his secretaries and so forth, after the war, they published little memoirs of their own. Actually, it was to build them a little pension pot, and Winston was quite happy with that. But they offered really personal insights into the man. And I like to think that I want to understand Winston Churchill not as that 65-year-old man out on a public stage with a cigar and a glass of whiskey. I want to imagine him sitting here at the end of a day and listen to what has mattered to him most. And that has come through the memoirs, as I say, of nurses, of private secretaries, and so forth. I once asked one of his private secretaries, I said, what was he really like? And she said, oh, he was wonderful. He was so wonderful. And I said, no, what was he really like? Oh, she said, well, actually, if you must know, he had a huge ego. He was occasionally a little arrogant. He was always incredibly impatient and sometimes bloody rude. But we loved him.
Do your characters sometimes, Anne Widdecombe said to me once that some of her characters in her novels often take her by surprise. But whereas other people who write novels, they've got the characters sketched out and they've got a definite plan and they know exactly what's going to happen to those characters. Which camp are you in?
I love the way that my characters suddenly grow. It is like watching, it is like watching your children because they do their own things. Look, I write thrillers, by and large, so thrillers require you to have a clear and quite powerful ending to the novel. So you've got to know where you want to get to. But I have very little idea anymore how I'm going to get there. I know that I'm starting from A and I've got to get to B eventually, but how I do that is often in the lap of the winds and imagination. But that is what makes it so exciting for you as a writer. You're living it too. And that's what makes you do this ridiculous job. It's not a proper job. I mean, it's not a proper job at all.
Try doing mine.
Well, they say that, I keep saying I've never had a proper job. I once used to write advertisements for a living. I then went to writing political manifestos. But then I decided to change completely, and I just write works of fiction.
Well, I've been told that if we don't get off this stage by 11:25, we're going to be physically ejected. So I'm afraid we have to call it quits. So, ladies and gentlemen, Michael Dobbs.
Disappointment
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Conservative Party Chairman, James Cleverly.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the auditorium. I hope you're having a fantastic conference. Thank you to everyone that's seen me and passed on their best wishes about the conference. I've passed that on to the team that helped make it happen. But today, this isn't about the conference. This is about our activists, our people, the ones who are making a real difference in the community. So, ladies and gentlemen, today I am going to be interviewing the people who actually make a real difference as Conservatives on the ground. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce them briefly now, and then also give them an opportunity to talk through what they do. We have Barry Ginley, Rena Ranger, Sean Anstey, Nicola Richards, and I'm going to invite to speak now the first Conservative leader, Bolton Council, in 40 years, David Greenhalgh. Thank you.
Thank you, Conference. It is indeed, James, an honour and a privilege to be standing here on the main platform, as James has said at conference, as the first Conservative leader of Bolton Council in almost 40 years. It isn't always easy being a Conservative up here. Over the years, we've certainly practised doing disappointment. We're up against it, a pretty organised and well-organised, oiled Labour machine. But I must pay credit to our associations and volunteers, party members in action, who, although relatively small in number, have campaigned tirelessly. We've targeted fiercely and chosen candidates wisely. And I have to pay tribute to my group of 20, 11 men, 9 women, who have stepped up to the plate and are delivering real change in Bolton, and more importantly, for the communities they represent. Bolton is made up of 7 parties, with Labour still, but hopefully not for very much longer, the largest party at 23, Conservatives 20, and then 17 other councillors from the remaining 5 parties made up from Liberal Democrats, UKIP, Brexit Party, and 2 hyper-local independent parties, all of whom were not quite ready to enter into coalition with us, but they were willing to support a Conservative-led administration and, more importantly, a Conservative budget. At the last local elections, the residents of Bolton voted for change. It's our responsibility to deliver. In our first 100 days, we've set out a clear direction of travel, an extra £10 million to resurface Bolton's worst roads, already processed and approved. Between 150 and 200 of the town's worst roads and pavements resurfaced, the first being done this month, and the next remainder over the next 18 months. A £1.5 million investment to the Cleaner Greener agenda, investing in our parks and children's play areas, purchasing more effective and efficient cleansing and grass-cutting equipment, stronger enforcement on fly tipping, planting more trees and wildflowers, and cleaning up the borough. Decision processed and being actioned. We reversed Labour's proposed increase in councillors' allowances and did away with political assistance, where there was only one, and it was Labour's. And we led and made decisions and make them more open and more transparently. Too many decisions were made previously behind closed doors. We are investing in our community groups, depoliticising the awards of grant funding in our community sector, taking that out of the hands of politicians and giving it to our local CVS. So much under Labour was what you know, but who you knew. We are strengthening our contractors' framework, supporting local businesses, increasing social value and keeping the pound in the local economy. And Bolton is open for business. The vision of our ambition £1.2 billion master plan is to rebuild our town centre with the private sector's help and investment. 2,000 new homes being built, 7,500 jobs being created, £412 million coming into the local economy. And we're not just talking about it, we're making it happen. Bolton is changing, ladies and gentlemen. As Conservatives, we are more representative than we have ever been, with more younger candidates, more women candidates, and more ethnic minority candidates standing for us than ever before, and reducing Labour majorities by 4 figures. We will continue to deliver that change, and we are proud that we are doing it in the great town that needs it so desperately and that we all so desperately love. Thank you very much indeed.
David, thank you. Thank you very much. And the next person I'd like to invite up to the podium is Nicola Richards. Nicola is a councillor in Dudley, part of Andy Street's team, and the Midlands manager for the Jewish Leadership Council.
Hello, conference. My name is Nicola Richards. I'm a Conservative councillor in Dudley, and I was elected when I was 20 years old. I'm now into my 2nd term of office, securing the biggest majority in the borough this year. I stood for election in 2014, the first time, at the age of 19, and came 3rd after a hard fight with UKIP and Labour. This year, I ran a campaign that gained this seat finally, electing my friend and colleague, Sue, who, without Sue, we wouldn't have control of Dudley Council. And we're now back in improving local services for local people. I feel so lucky to have been encouraged by so many locally who, for some reason, when I was 16 years old, doing work experience for my local MP, saw some kind of potential and thought that I might make a good councillor. Without these people, and without the Conservative Party, I would not be where I am today. 9 years ago, I was too nervous to knock on a door, and now you just can't stop me. It blows my mind sometimes that a young girl from the Black Country has been given such opportunities. I used to get asked, why are you a Conservative? Why would a young person be a Conservative? And I just don't see any reason why I wouldn't be. Growing up in a normal working class family who succeeded by working hard, it meant I was the first in my family to go to university. We're a family of natural Conservatives and the West Midlands is full of them. I have the great pleasure of working with Andy Street at the moment, our fantastic Mayor of the West Midlands, a natural leader of the region that is home to industry, a man that understands business and the importance of investing in infrastructure. We know the Labour Party have let the West Midlands down for far too long. They've taken us for granted, but we're going to keep showing them that those days are well and truly over. We're not just the party of opportunity, we're inclusive. The work I've done within the Jewish community has been truly eye-opening. I've seen and heard firsthand how bad it feels for them at the moment. I am more than ashamed. It hurts me to the core that anti-Semitism is still a blight on our society. My friends in the community look on in despair at what is happening. And we're always anti-Semitism and all racism seriously. It's incumbent on all of us, whatever faith, background, political party, whatever, to speak up and stand up against this. There are some things that do not have shades, that do not have nuances. They are simply wrong. So what does the party mean to me? It means it's the party of opportunity, doing the right thing, making people's lives better, giving people, young people, the best start in life, building more houses, investing in education. We're the party that doesn't ignore the will of the people, and I know we're the party that will carry out the will of the majority in Dudley that voted to leave the EU. And for me, it's the party that gave a 16-year-old girl from the Black Country a chance to represent the community that they love. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Nicola, thank you. Thank you so very much. So the next up to the podium, I'd like to invite Councillor Sean Anstey, who is the former leader of Trafford Council, became a leader at the age of 26. Sean.
Well, James, conference, thank you very much. And I think David was referring before in his opening remarks that sometimes it's quite tough up here. And I think we know that too well in Trafford, that it is quite tough sometimes for us, and politics doesn't always go your way. But the reason why I wanted to still take the opportunity, I think, to reflect and to speak to conference today is this. 17 years ago, when I was joining the Conservative Party, it was because I'd seen a Labour member who'd come round to my house in Partington, and they'd said, "Look, Sean, we're building this new health centre for you. Aren't we fantastic? We're a great Labour Party, we're doing this for you." And I said, "But it's the same people going into this health centre, and it's the same doctors that work in it." So this idea that you can just throw money at something and make it better, I think is wrong. And that sparked my interest to join the Tory party, and it sparked my interest to say that politics should be used for the force for good that it can be, which is to actually take decisions for the people of the places that we seek to serve. And that's what we did in Trafford. Very proud of the Conservative administration in Trafford from 2004, an administration that in a northern metropolitan authority delivered some of the joint highest performing children's services in the country, the highest recycling rates of any metropolitan authority, the lowest council tax in the northwest, a new university institution, the Metrolink line out to the Trafford Centre, and of course played our part in the devolution of powers and funding to Greater Manchester. And when that change happened 18 months ago, and the administration became a Labour administration, they have worked tirelessly to treble pay on senior managers in Trafford. They've reversed a voluntary reduction in members' allowances just for Labour members. We've seen our children's services fall into inadequate. You see missed bin collections increasing. It takes some skill to do that in 18 months, but that, my friends, is what the Labour Party does when it takes power. But it puts across to you on a regular basis that they're moralising the righteousness that comes across from them, that they're right, and they're not. And that's why we, all of us, regardless of the circumstances that we find ourselves in, dedicate ourselves to the party, campaign for it, because we know that when the Conservative Party wins, and we will win Trafford back again in future, we can do so much better for our people and places. Thank you very much.
Sean, thank you. Thank you so very much. The next person who will be joining us up on stage, Councillor Rena Ranger from Three Rivers Council, passionate campaigner and champion for more diversity and more women in the party. Rena.
Good morning. Thank you. About 15 years ago, I was invited to a dinner to support an energetic, vibrant young mother who wanted to run for Parliament. She was an accidental politician and had been elected as a councillor after being encouraged to do so following a successful community action project that she was involved in. I listened to her story in awe as to what she had achieved and what she was embarking on. She was making a positive difference in her community. 8 years later, somebody asked me to help with some community action, and all the reasons and excuses I would have had to say no, my lack of political experience, my young children, they melted away remembering that earlier dinner and that lady's story. She unwittingly became my role model. She resonated with me, and seeing how she had navigated her path, I saw I could navigate a similar one. Inspired by the power of role models, I went on to create a social initiative called Women Empowered, which always has men involved. And for the last 7 years, we have brought stories and experiences for others to be inspired by, to do whatever that special thing is that makes a difference to their life as they see it. And one of our success stories is me. I was asked by my local branch to stand as a candidate in the local elections. And in all honesty, I don't think I'd met that many councillors before, and my understanding of the depth and breadth of services that local councillors were responsible for was very limited. Councillors don't get the same exposures as members of parliament, and for the most part, council is a background kind of thought in people's political minds. You pay your council tax, the bins get collected, and some people feel the same anxiety applying for planning permission as they did when they faced their school exams. But again, inspired by that same lady's story, I said yes. And 5 years ago, I was elected to Three Rivers District Council, and being a councillor is a privilege and it's a role that I love. I love being an active member of our community, getting to know people and advocating for our ward and our residents. Life in opposition isn't always easy and can be frustrating, but there's a lot of good that you can do, and the difference that you make to somebody's life, big or small, gives you a sense of unparalleled pride. It took me some time to convince my branch members that some of the changes I wanted to make in how we connect with our residents wasn't dangerous or nefarious. I simply wanted to email them. We knock on doors regularly, and we ask our residents if we can keep in touch via email about the important things: bin collection after Christmas, roads that will be closed for repair, and we have had over 1,000 email addresses collected for an electorate of just over 4,500. We can communicate quickly, our messages read at leisure, and many of our ward residents now who know who their local councillors are with far more recognition. It's made me and my fellow ward councillors minor celebrities at the local supermarket. It's my 6th year as a councillor, and there have been many times when I've knocked on the door and a parent has brought their young daughter out to come and meet me, and I always tell them the same thing. You can be a doctor, a teacher, a singer. You can work with elephants and be a local councillor. And I hope that one day, unwittingly, maybe I'll be remembered when one of those little girls, many years later, is asked to, or I hope proactively gets involved with their local communities and maybe its governance too. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Next up on stage, I'm going to invite Barry Ginley. Barry is a long-standing activist in local government in Kent, and he's also the Deputy Chair of the Conservative Disability Group. Thank you, Barry.
Good morning, conference. I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of the Conservative Disability Group to thank the party for giving us the opportunity to present today. I think it's one of the first times that we've ever had the main stage, so thank you for that. I've been a member of the party for many years, and 10 years ago I thought it's about time I used my experience of my own disability and to try and help the party to become more inclusive for disabled people as activists, as candidates, and as MPs, and we even have some disabled members of the Lords as well. So disabled people throughout our whole party being active and ensuring that our perspective of life is considered at all stages of our party's development. I've been totally blind for 25 years now, and that, although a shock, didn't mean that I had to give up my goals and ambitions. And getting involved with politics was one of those ambitions. Long before I lost my sight, I thought it'd be nice to be a member of Parliament, and you know, I'd like to be helping the Conservative Party, you know, make life better for everybody, not just disabled people. But my experiences as somebody who's disabled helps bring a different perspective on our policies and our practices, and that's what we in the CDG try to aim, to be a critical friend for our party, try and guide on how policy can benefit the 13.9 million disabled people in the UK. That number's only going to grow because our population is getting older. So it becomes more and more important that all of our services, all of our policies and practices become more inclusive. So people such as myself, and I'm sure many in the audience, can continue to live their lives when they may acquire disability as getting older. We should never be forgotten, you know, and please, when you go back to your councils or your constituencies, urge any disabled candidates and activists to step forward and show the population and the country that this party is more inclusive than any other political party. Thank you very much.
Barry, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so very, very much. Thank you to everybody. Now, ladies and gentlemen, hopefully you will have been utilising the app. I can see a number of questions coming through. Remember, you can input a question of your own using the app. If there's a question that's already been asked that you think deserves to be answered, you can vote it up on the app. So we're going to go initially to the most popular question on the app at the moment, and a number of you have touched upon this already. But I'm going to start with you. David. How did you first get involved in the Conservative Party, and did a particular person ask you to join?
I'm afraid it's a bit boring. You're going to regret this. I mean, I actually grew up in a reasonably conservative household, so it's probably not the... I've not got a great backstory with this, I'm afraid, that I was suddenly approached and inspired. I probably came into it in a roundabout way in that I just really fell in love with the whole campaigning aspect of it to start with. So I went, I simply grew up in a household that was very heavily involved in conservatism. So, and from that got inspired, obviously, went away to university, came back, started a career, but then came back and decided to get back involved in the community and revisit and start representing, because I think that's probably the heart of everything, and that's where we tend to go. So I think the community involvement is key to all this, and if we persuade people through our community, our commitment to communities, people will start to listen to us more closely and pay attention to us as they start to see the work we're doing.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, just to prove that this is live and interactive, we have a question which has been asked in direct response to Rena's speech, and it is, and I'll read the question verbatim, we never found out who Rena's role model was. Who was it? I need to know! Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark.
She was a local councillor in Amersham, and she still is, and she was the first BME, I think, chairman of Amersham Council, or mayor, I don't know what they exactly call it, but it was a lady called Mimi Harker.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, there you go. And look, you know, if you see someone that you think should be involved in politics, reach out, bring them on board. Barry, who was it that inspired you? Was it a particular person, a particular event? What made you want to get involved in politics?
Okay, my real inspiration and the person that really impacted me, I remember in May 1979, waking up one morning as an 11-year-old boy and seeing our first female Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. And the reason why she had such an influence, my dad's was a long-distance lorry driver, and he was forever being taken out on strike by the unions. And as we only had his income coming into the house, you know, it meant that we had to go short on many things. Mrs. T came in and sort of put the great back into Britain, and so therefore, you know, she was my real inspiration. And it was unusual because we were a Labour voting household at the time, but we're all now good Conservatives.
Ah, outstanding, outstanding. Another, right, this question is becoming very popular. I'm going to come to Sean initially on this. What has made the biggest difference in your campaigning?
I mean, I think we had a scenario, and we're working back to this, I think, of when we had clear messaging, good decisions, and regular communication. I mean, you really can't say much more than that. And, you know, like I said in my reflections, clearly sometimes that works particularly better for us, sometimes it doesn't. But what you're fighting for is, and that passion and those values. So we had some fantastic candidates, some great activists who came out for us, and that trying to create some fun in campaigning, frankly. I mean, nobody wants to particularly go out on a Saturday morning and shove literature through people's letterboxes, but you have to do it because it furthers the values and causes that we all believe in. And so just holding true to those values, making sure you do it consistently, we found was certainly a more engaging way of getting people involved with us.
Yeah, fantastic. So Nicola, you've been involved in the fantastically successful campaign to get Andy elected as our Conservative mayor for the West Mid. So, yeah, what's made the biggest difference for you in terms of campaign? What do you like about it?
I think really he can in some ways make it quite easy for us because he's doing so many good things. He's so likeable. He's not a typical politician, you know. He's a businessman. He understands how business works. He understands the economy in the West Midlands and how important it is for every single person that lives there. And so, you know, and also he's very likeable. Anyone that meets him loves him. So it's about, you know, getting the message out about what he's doing for that area. He's doing something for everybody. He's going to make a good impact on every person's life in the West Midlands, and we've just got to carry on telling people about it.
Brilliant, fantastic. Oh, here we go. We've got a runaway winner at the moment. Those of you, you've been voting. Of course, the thing is, you know what the questions are going to be, but the panel don't. Barry, it's one for you again. This is going to be a tough, difficult, probing question. What's the name of the dog?
I must have ESP because I thought that was coming. She's called Skye, and she's named after the Isle of Skye, not the broadcaster. Sorry, Sky Broadcasting.
Okay, another popular one. It's going to put me under a bit of pressure, David, and I'll come to you first on this. What more do you want to see from CCHQ?
Oh my goodness me.
Okay, good answer.
I want them to listen to the voluntary party a little bit more, and I think you already do, but I think I think it's a little bit like turning around an ocean liner. I've compared that to us in Bolton as well when we took over from Labour. But I think it is. I think there's a bit of a perception out there as well that you're fighting against, and I think all the, without flanneling you too much, all the noises I'm hearing are that you're out there and you are listening to people. But I think, you know, there are so many unsung heroes in this party that literally, you know, whether it's stuffing envelopes, delivering leaflets, just work tirelessly for the party. And I think, you know, they're just a little bit, I think, more of recognition of those people. I also think, you know, I'm a great one for, I said before in my speech, picking the right candidates for the right areas. And I think, you know, if there's one message that I could give to you, putting on the national thing, I think, you know, we've some great local candidates out there as well, and I think, you know, start to give them a bit of a chance somewhere.
Okay, yeah, I think that's useful feedback, genuine feedback. And look, please, ladies and gentlemen, if there are ideas that you've got for what we can do at CCHQ to make it better, please get in touch. chairman@conservatives.com. Send me emails about how you think we can improve. A very, very, I think popular is the wrong word for this, a really important issue. And Nicola, I want to come to you initially with this one. How do you deal with toxicity and personal attacks in campaigning at the local level? And I think, Nicola, and then Rena, I'm going to ask you that one as well, because I know that it can be really hard for women in politics.
It can be very difficult, and I've been mainly lucky with the experience I've had on the doorstep. The once that I was really annoyed, one woman opened the door and said, you're 20 years old and you think you can be my councillor. My daughter's 20 and she can't do it. And I was like, but I'm not your daughter. And sometimes it can really, you know, I've only had very few very bad examples where you'll have someone slam the door and shout at you. It's more online where it's a problem, and because I like to consider myself an advocate for the Jewish community, that then multiplies it. I don't know whether they think I'm Jewish, I'm not. I can get anti-Semitic abuse, even though I'm not Jewish. That slant of things is really hard. I watched Question Time in Dudley a few months ago. from the balcony as a councillor, wasn't involved in the show, took a selfie up there before the show started, and the amount of abuse I got for months was ridiculous. And I think it's the left that they don't like. There's a young female from Dudley. There's lots of us. There's lots of Conservatives around. They hate it.
Oh, okay.
We've got to carry on.
Thank you. Rena, what's your experience been?
It can be hard, and like you will have some people who are very not nice to you at the doorstep, and you can get chased out of a driveway at some times, and then people will accuse you of stuff or question your values. But I think we have conviction in what we stand for, and we know that the things that we are doing in our communities, or the values that the Conservative Party have, are genuinely values that many of us hold, whether it's education and all the rest of it. And it is about having those conversations calmly on the doorstep and articulating our message to try and get through some of that noise, to say this is what we stand for and this is what we believe and this is why we're doing X, Y, and Z. But it is unfortunate. I think you do have to be a bit thick-skinned about things and realise that some of those voices, some of that noise, there may not be people who you just have to let it go, because the good you do just drowns some of that out.
Yeah.
It's a sad reality, but...
Yeah, it is. Sean, I'm going to come to you next. And there are a couple of questions which I'm going to kind of just squish together because they're quite similar. You were a council leader at the age of 26. I can't even remember being 26. It's that far away now. So how do we go about inspiring more young people into particularly representative politics? What advice would you give them to that?
Well, I mean, I think first of all we need to keep on doing what we do, which is to broaden our appeal, to get people have conviction. That's really important. It's that point about abuse and belief. Generally, if somebody's not happy with you, you're doing something right. So you just need to keep on trying to sort of work through that. And I was very fortunate in Trafford that when my predecessor stood down, I'd been his deputy for a few years. I'd been cabinet member for finance. And they'd, in fact, when I was selected to stand in Bowden at 1920, was nearly 11 years ago, they took a risk, really. They took a punt on a young person who'd come from a family that wasn't involved in politics, and they tried to do it. And the party locally needs to do more of that. And answer the question about what CCHQ needs to do, it needs to encourage more of that to happen. And then we just need to support young members through that period, because it's right, it's been mentioned already. You learn things that you never thought you'd had to learn before, like how a council works and the resilience that you need to be able to do this. If you get that right, there's no reason why we won't get more people involved.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, absolutely. Actually, Sean, I'm going to stick with you for another question, just for a moment, which is about what tips you would give to help get better levels of Conservative representation in other northern towns and cities.
Well, I tried to win the Greater Manchester mayoralty a few years ago and had the fortune of standing against Andy Burnham. But, we polled 128,000 votes in that election. And, that's 128,000 votes for people where we said, do you know what, this might be a city or a city region where, the Labour Party have some of their heavyweight dominant seats. But we're just not going to take that line down. We're going to go out and say that, for the reasons that I said in my remarks, this is where I think the Labour Party are wrong, this is where I think the opposition parties are wrong, here's where I think we're right. And there's places now like Greater Manchester that are benefiting from Conservative policies, Conservative local government in Bolton, and we need to keep on doing that, sharing that message, because it's blindingly obvious to me, and I'm a fairly nuanced sort of person, but when we do get it right, there's no reason why there's not a part of this country that shouldn't feel they're able to vote Conservative. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And David, I have to come to you as well on this. What more can we do to continue our success in the north?
I think the interesting thing that we have to acknowledge is that the tribalism is going. There isn't the inherent, whether that's because of Brexit or whatever, the party affiliation, that my grandfather, the number of times I've had said to me over the last couple of years in Bolton, my grandfather and father would be spinning in their graves if they knew I was voting Conservative. But they are doing. And yes, we have to look to the other end of the spectrum as well, in our more affluent areas, in a sense, where we might have a little bit more liberalism going on. But there's a definite change of, and we need to reach out to those people. That's the main thing. These are areas that predominantly we have maybe put to one side and said, oh, we're not doing so well there. We are doing well there now, and I would say to all associations, go into those areas, test the waters, and you'll be surprised. There should be no areas where you should, if you're in a strong Leave area, particularly in the north, the chances for making real gains, and it doesn't happen overnight, it happens over a period of years and elections, and if you can get the same candidate to work that seat over a period of time, a good local, get involved in that community, make a name for themselves, people are looking for someone that they can just admire in politics, and the community is the best way through to that. But people are out there, they're fair game at the moment, and we should be in those communities fighting to bring them back to us.
Fantastic, absolutely, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we are nearly done. We are nearly done. I've got one more question. I'm going to ask this question to each of our panelists in turn. And I think really this is a great question for us to finish with. So the question is this, and I'll start with you, Barry, then work back towards this way. What makes you optimistic about the future for our party?
I'm optimistic because we are the party of Great Britain, and I think that people do relate to our values, and we just need to sort of get past our current climate and then sort of, just really sort of push the Conservative message forward to everybody. There's a lot of Labour and Lib voters who are desperate to come and vote for us, so let's get them over to us.
Fantastic. Rena.
I'm optimistic because on this stage in just the last couple of days, you've had so many policy announcements that will make a positive difference to people's lives, daily lives, and those messages need to get out. And I appreciate, we need to get Brexit done so those messages can get out and people can really hear what the Conservative Party has in store for the future, and they are positive messages of what we can become and where we can go, and I think that those just need to be heard a little bit more.
Fantastic, fantastic. Sean?
James, I think a diversity of opinion in a unified party, that's what makes me optimistic about the future, and our people, all of us in this room, all of us who are elected, we keep going, and that's what the Conservative Party's always done. I'm sure it's what we'll always do, will do, and keep going, we will win.
Fantastic. Nicola?
So I'm optimistic because I think in the West Midlands especially, we have a great team of MPs and councillors who all unite under Andy Street's leadership, and I'm positive that we're going to keep on winning in the West Midlands.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's... Yeah. David?
I'm optimistic locally because we're moving forward with a great agenda in Bolton with what people want for a sea change. I'm optimistic nationally because we finally have, I think, a Prime Minister and a government that are finally representing the people and doing what they want.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for engaging in this process. Thank you so very much for the questions that came in. There are a couple that unfortunately we couldn't fit in because of time, but I'm going to finish by answering the question that I asked the panellists. And the thing that makes me so incredibly optimistic about the future of the party are the kind of people who make our party work. People like Barry and Rena and Sean and Nicola and David, people like you. You are what makes me optimistic about the fantastic future that we have for our party and for our country. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Staying over here impossible. Baby, I'm Thank you. And if we look a bit more broadly, if we think in community terms, Nick, maybe you can take the same question, but from a community angle. So what helps you engage with a community who maybe have lost trust too?
And I think, you know, nothing more than what's been said to some extent about the importance of the individual and spending time listening. But I think actually then it's about how do you bring those people together. And what we often find is that people have common ground, they just don't know it because they don't spend time listening to each other. And we hear a lot of difference and we hear a lot of people in disagreement and conflict. But actually when you find time and create a space for people to hear each other, often they have shared common interests and shared stories, whether that be about housing or services or education. And if we can create the opportunity for people to listen to each other effectively, I think then we can find the common ground by which people can act together.
Fantastic, thank you. Kaniz, can I pick up on that and maybe you could talk or maybe even give us an example? So Nick talked about how can you have conversations and listen to one another, and I know a lot of your work is about conversations, so it would be great, I think, for us to hear perhaps an example of a conversation.
So one of the Real People Honest Talk sessions that we did in one of the cities, within that area there was a lot of gang crime, and so there was a lot of anger from the two to three different communities that we had engaged to take part in our Real People Honest Talk. So on the first session, the anger was really expressed from one community to say, what are the parents doing to stop this from happening, where we don't feel safe on the streets. It's not fair that we're having to live like this. Parents have a responsibility. And so we let everyone talk what they needed to on the first session. But on the second session, our mum talked about her journey of her 19-year-old lad who had been criminally exploited from the age of 11. So that's year 7 when he's gone into high school. And then her struggle when she found out when he was about the age of 16, and how she'd coped and what she'd gone through and how she tried to bring him back and the journey that she was still on. And I think the most important thing for me was, as I watched the group dynamics, as that conversation was developing, I wanted to ask the question at the end, has anything changed about your thoughts or perceptions about somebody else in this room? And there was a resounding yes, especially from the lady that was really upset at the parents. She said, I didn't realize that this is what the parents are going through as well. Now these two ladies still meet, they're still friends, they go to each other's houses, and a friendship was formed on empathy and understanding. And that's what we do day in, day out.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Thank you. Christopher, you touched in your speech about the potential to replicate or scale up. I think you referred to a conversation with our Secretary of State and DCMS at an earlier point. I just wonder whether you could briefly expand on how that might happen.
Yes. Look, I don't think there is any silver bullet which can come from Westminster which will solve the ills of our communities. There's no brilliant educational idea we're going to get from Singapore or from Scandinavia or something like this. No, communities have got to grow from within. We've got to generate the British economy from within local communities. That's how we have strength right across the country. So I think, if I look at my own workforce, the best people we've got are local people, local jobs for local people. And if we can persuade the wealth creators in this country to invest in local communities and give opportunities for high-level jobs and build those communities into desirable places to live and work, turn them into green towns, into eco-towns, into places that people really want to be, then we'll generate growth from within. I don't think there's any other way. Just do it the Conservative way. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much indeed. Nick, if I can return to you for a moment. How do you go about recruiting your community organisers? Because most of us want to talk to somebody who looks a bit like us and sounds a bit like us and grew up where we grew up as a starting point. So how do you address that?
So one of the ways we do that is we work with this network of what we call social action hubs. So they're locally rooted organisations that are already connected to their place, and we support those organisations to develop their understanding and be able to train local people in organising. But what we're also finding is that this kind of messages are being picked up elsewhere. The importance of local people coming together to do things is a message that's being picked up on social media and in other places, and people are joining and connecting with us. And when that happens, we're just saying to them, give it a go. Go and find a couple of neighbours and go and talk to them. Go and speak to your next door neighbour, find out the things they care about, and actually start to listen to each other. And I guess, so on the one hand, we work with the organisations, but on the other hand as well, we're sort of working with local people to help them, to give them the courage, in essence, and the belief that they can create the changes at that level.
Great. And Val, if I can ask you, in a similar way, is there a role for some of the guys you've worked with to influence others? Do you work with any kind of peer mentors, or what's the place of that?
Yeah, we actually employ, at the moment, an ex-offender ourselves, and one comes voluntary as well. I'll tell you another little story about a guy called Richard who we helped. He was one of the most prolific offenders in Bradford. The police said, you're working with Richard. Sorry?
You're doing what Boris does.
So, you're working with Richard. He says, are you mad, Val? He said, you don't know he's absolutely chaotic in the community with crime. I want to give him a chance. So we did, and 3.5 years later, Richard's still in work, no offences, and he cost this country on his own, working out with his convictions, £1.5 million in crime.
That we know of.
That we know of. Richard actually said to me, multiply that by 3 or 4, Val, for what I got away with. Richard then rang me one day out in the blue just quickly, said to me, Val, he says, I've just realised, this is, a light bulb moment. The last 10 years of my life I've really wasted. He says, is there any way that you can help me talk to some kids, 17, 18-year-old kids, to stop them wasting 10 years of their life? And so what we're doing at the minute is getting him into a young offenders institution, and it's a real life guy who's gone through what they've gone through, and there's no better person to do it.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Thank you. Kenise, when we were having coffee earlier, you mentioned to me a quote from a young man in one of your sessions about identity and belonging. Do you want to just briefly say what he said?
So within our Catalyst Leadership course, we have a session on faith, identity and belonging, and we ask the young people, where is it that you think that you belong? And one of the young people put his answer that I don't belong in prison. So it wasn't where he belonged, it was where he didn't belong, and I suppose that was what his thoughts were, that's where he's going to end up. But within the time of the 4 days, and his relationships had built with his peers that were in that room, and also he disclosed the fact that he had been diagnosed with a specific learning need in the February before his exams. So he had no chance at getting his GCSEs, and he was always on the behaviour management plans, always in trouble. But he didn't want to end up in prison. But what he did was he evoked empathy from his peers, and his peers have supported him into a tax-paying job now, and he's contributing to society, and he's doing really, really well. It might not that we make the world of difference, but if we make a difference to one person's life, at least we've done something. And his peers are the same age as him, 16, 17. They're not older than him. They've done it together.
Thank you. Marie, you spoke very powerfully about bottom-up, not top-down. But when you think about what government can do to support community groups like yours, what are the things that you think we should keep in mind?
I just think that the government should get all the community groups together and work with them and talk to them, because the community know what their community needs, and that's what I think they should do. And with so much of our organisations out there that are doing knife and gun crime, working with women that go through domestic violence. We're all doing it, and we need to work collaboratively together. They need to come together and say, like, what are you doing? How can we help you? And as I said, the community fosters a community.
Yes.
We know what we want, and all we just need is your help to put everything, to shape everything for us.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to add anything about what government should be doing? Christopher, you look on the edge of your seat. Tell us.
I have an idea of how this government could energise local communities and energise the young talent. Our company, for one, would be happy to sponsor a school, and our company is happy to sponsor young people through university. Why doesn't the Chancellor take the very successful research and development tax credit and create another version, learning and skills tax credit, and incentivise employers like us to sponsor pupils through school and give free tuition fees at university? That would be a terrific win for this government. Now, I can see how it can be done, because they're doing it in Germany. It's earn while you learn. You spend time at a company and you spend time at the university, and you have a degree with parity of value. So I think that would be a Conservative principle, to incentivise the wealth creators and the enterprise world to sponsor education and look after the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed. Is there anything more any of you would like to say about getting people involved in their community? Kenise? Yeah.
At the moment, the tensions within communities are really high. Our job is quite difficult on the ground to bring people from different communities and different faiths together. I think that the way that we use language, the way that we communicate is really, really important. I serve the Batley and Spen and Dewsbury communities, and I have found that they're my sisters. And I think that language is so important when we're talking from top down, so that we can create a cohesive communities where everybody is respectful of each other.
Yeah, thank you very much. Marie.
One thing I do say to the women that I work with and the men and the young people, am I my sister's keeper? Yes, I am. Am I my brother's keeper? Yes, I am. And that's what I try to teach them, learn them.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. We heard from a couple of you about what drove you into setting up your organisations, but I felt there might be a bit more, Steve or Val, that we could hear from one of you about what the motivator was.
I guess when you work in a very negative environment, like a busy local prison, where there's usually around about 1,000, in our case, men, very troubled men locked up, and there's very little hope for them, actually. They walk out of the door with £46, and if they're lucky, clothes that fit them, depending on how long they've been in, of course. But it's sad to think that nobody's prepared to give them a chance. We've spoken to guys who have left prison and said, actually, the time in prison wasn't the hard bit. Coming out's the hard bit, because society turns its back on you. So we've created a model that most people can empathise with. I get that there's certain crimes that people deserve locking up for a long time, if not forever, and there aren't many people that can empathise with those. However, there's a bulk of people in and out of prison who, as we alluded to earlier, have been failed by society. They've never had a chance. They've had no education, no parental support. You know, is it right that in the 21st century we're saying that, well, sorry, but that's your life? Well, we don't think so. And hence we set up the charity. And it's becoming a bit of a little movement in Yorkshire. We've now got over 50 employers who will willingly give an ex-offender an interview. And we can replicate that around the country. we're not just going to grow it exponentially, but we can replicate the model. So if you imagine 150 people who otherwise would be committing crimes, causing more victims, costing the taxpayer a fortune, now they're going to work and putting back into the economy. And they're good role models for their children. It's intergenerational change. Huge impact. That 150, with the right level of support, we're not going to go around with begging bowl, but with the right level of support, that can be replicated in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 cities, and that can become 1,000 people who otherwise would probably, the majority of them, turn back to crime and be causing misery on our streets.
Well, you might not go around with a begging bowl, but thank you. You may not go around with a begging bowl, but I'm happy to do a shameless plug. If there are any employers around here, we've got their numbers, so we can put you in touch. I'm going to ask now Helen Waitley to just say a couple of words to close this session. Helen.
Thank you. That was inspiring. Some of your stories brought tears to my eyes, but you've also filled me with hope and with determination, and I'm sure I am not alone. In my new job as Arts and Tourism Minister, I'm spending lots of time going all around the country meeting people who are doing fabulous things, people who are creating, discovering, innovating, opening minds, bringing people together and making a difference. And you guys have brought some of that into this conference hall this afternoon. You have shared with us a precious insight into what you do, how you are making things better in the places you live and work in, often some of the toughest places in the country. And we should be in no doubt what that must actually mean for you personally, the hours that you guys must be putting in, the determination it takes, the courage you must have of your convictions, your resilience, and your drive to make things better. I also know that politics is far from friendly at the moment. Coming here today may mean that some of you will get some flack. You should not. Anyone out there who criticizes you for coming here today is the lesser for it. But I recognize that you may. So can I say a sincere and heartfelt thank you to all the panelists here for coming here, for speaking to us, to sharing with us the work that you do. From me, from Baroness Barron, and from all of us at this conference, thank you.
Sean was an inspiration for me, you know, and I'm a youth worker now.
Sean understands some of what it feels like being a Londoner, that he can be, in my opinion, trusted to look after London.
That someone from our community is the Mayor of London. It's, you know, like, it's like we've all achieved something.
I grew up in one of the poorest parts of London. I saw people around me get sucked into crime from an early age. My mum did her best to keep me out of trouble. But when you hear your friend has been stabbed to death, you remember it for the rest of your life. That's when I decided to become a youth worker, and when I really saw what crime does to communities. I've seen families devastated by murder. I've seen bright young people end up in prison, and that's why I'm standing for Mayor of London. Watching what was happening to London, seeing the mayor paralysed by the crime epidemic, I knew I had to stand.
But we don't have enough role models, that we literally need more of you.
London gave me everything, and in return, I will give everything to London to make it a safer place. Afternoon conference, great to see you all. My name's Sean Bailey. Last year, I introduced myself as your next Mayor of London, and I shared my story of how I came to be on this stage in front of you. In the last 12 months, I've spoken to thousands of Londoners about what they would like to see to make London a better place to live. And for most Londoners, it's been very simple. They want a mayor who actually does the job. They want to get to work for a reasonable price on time. They want to breathe clean air and have a clean environment. They want a house they can actually afford. But above all things, they want a safe city. Londoners are busy, optimistic, energetic, ambitious. They want a London that's not in their way so they can get on with their lives. And I could spend all day talking about how the current mayor, Sadiq Khan, is failing them. Since I last appeared on this stage in front of you, there has been over 100 murders in London. There's been 4,000 people stabbed, 20,000 people sexually assaulted, and over 70,000 burglaries. Just last week, we've had stabbings in Croydon, Camden, Harrow, Fulham, Wandsworth. 2 days ago, a stabbing in the place in which I grew up, Ladbroke Grove. And let's be clear, these are real people, real families being torn apart. Every victim is a Londoner that has been failed by the current mayor. The police come to work every day knowing that they're facing danger, and they do it with an incredible sense of duty. Unfortunately for us all, the current mayor does not do that. For me, he is the Police and Crime Commissioner of London. But instead of backing the police, he's busy building Brand Khan, throwing beach parties, sponsoring bicycle ballet, plastering his picture all over London in a bid to become the leader of the Labour Party. But again, for me, the clue is in the job title. Police and Crime Commissioner for London. We need someone who takes responsibility. For Sadiq Khan, it's always somebody else's fault, never his responsibility. He's blamed government, he's blamed communities, he's blamed teachers for the rise in crime. And let's be clear, crime is destroying lives, it's plaguing London. We deserve better. Let's remind ourselves what it was like when it was better, when we had a Conservative mayor of London, one Boris Johnson. I believe you've all met him. Let's focus for a second. The murder rate was cut in half. 11,000 dangerous weapons removed from the street. Overall crime down by 20%. In his first day in the job, he pledged an extra 20,000 police officers nationwide. What it is, conference, our party, your party, this Conservative party, gets delivery in a way that Corbyn's Labour simply never will. What we need is someone who understands the city, who loves London, who knows what it's like to be there. For you, those of you who don't know me, I have a very London story. I was born and brought up in London, in Ladbroke Grove, living in the shadow of Grenfell all my life. I come from a poor community where welfare was a lifeline, but work was a lifesaver. I spent 20 years as a youth worker, running around helping the young people build the lives that they wanted. I'm thankful that I was born in London and able to build a life that I wanted. I know what can be achieved. I've lived it, I've been there. I speak to people every day who are faced with the issues that drive crime. When we remove the barriers, we can really help young people. If we protect our young people from gangs, they can avoid crime. If we protect our young people and give them access to work, They have roots out of the hood. If we support families, our communities don't need to struggle. So what we need is a full-time mayor, not a mayor whose ambition it is to build their own PR, but a mayor whose sole purpose is to lift up the millions of Londoners and show them there is another way. If there's one thing that Sadiq Khan has failed to understand, if we have safe streets, then we have safe schools. If we have safe streets, then businesses will invest. If we have straight streets, then our communities need not struggle. Of course, London needs clean air, better transport, and many, many more homes for people to live in. But let's be clear, if the streets are not safe, the capital cannot thrive. That's why I have a plan to tackle crime in London. A record amount of police with money that already exists in City Hall. A zero-tolerance approach to crime. Mandatory sentences for those carrying acid or knives on the first attempt. Not the second, not the third, on their first offence. But let's be clear. Let's be clear, we simply cannot just arrest our way out of this problem. That is why I will start Operation London Ceasefire, a project to get our young people back on the right track, to give them access to opportunity. In short, what I'm offering here is a get real approach. We've got to do something now, not in 10 years' time, now. And as part of that approach, we'll do housing. I've already launched my plan for Housing for London. HFL. Do the sign of me. HFL. Nobody playing. But it's a serious thing. It will be a City Hall-backed housing developer with a singular focus to provide the homes that Londoners need, where they need them, and when they need them. I'll electrify the entire London bus fleet, the equivalent of removing 1 million vehicles from the roads. This is how you really green our environment. You don't telegraph. This isn't about telegraphing virtue, it's about making the environment cleaner. And for a start, just for a start, 5 youth zones, so that our young people can get the recreation and the access to training that they need so they can enjoy themselves. Our young people must have respite. They must have a place to have fun. But number one, the first step, the big step, the jumping off point is to solve London's crime emergency. That's why on this stage here today, I pledge to you to spend every minute of every day over the next 8 months making London a safer place. And when we win in London, and make no mistake, we can win in London. We must win in London. I will work tirelessly to keep London moving. Londoners don't want to think about the Mayor of London. They want a city that works for all. I will give us that. A city that keeps us moving, keeps us safe, keeps us secure, so that Londoners can concentrate on the opportunities that London has to offer. So I ask you, conference, stand with me in my quest to make London a safer place, a better place. You and I all know it is conservative values that will make London as great as any city has ever been anywhere in the history of mankind. That's the goal. We must demonstrate to people, but this is about the poorest. We must demonstrate to people we are about lifting people up. When someone asks you why you're supporting this mission, it's because we're for people. So my last request to you is, Stand up, be counted, and help me make London a safer place. Thank you. One thing, as a couple of... Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your panel chair, Katie Bourne.
I know, but you go. Go on, Anthony. Okay, good. So, good afternoon, everyone. There we go. Welcome to our session on crime and justice. Hope you'll find it really interesting, very exciting. Obviously, we're going to invite questions from the floor as well. But before we get started, and before I introduce you to our panel, we're going to have a short video from the Lord Chancellor and Justice Secretary Robert Buckland, QC. So we're waiting for that, hopefully, to come up on our screens.
Good afternoon, conference. I'm sorry I can't be with you in Manchester for this session. One of my duties as Lord Chancellor is to attend the opening of the legal year at Westminster Abbey, so that's what I've been doing today. The opening of the legal year is a great occasion. It's a celebration of the rule of law. Ever since Magna Carta, over 800 years ago, the rule of law has been the cornerstone of our Constitution, and our independent, impartial judiciary is renowned throughout the world. One of the key components of the rule of law is openness and transparency. I've spent a lifetime working in criminal justice, firstly as a barrister, a part-time judge, and then in politics as Solicitor General, Prisons Minister, and now in Cabinet. As a sentencing judge, I've had to make some hard choices. Sending people to prison is never easy, but often it is absolutely necessary. But time and again, over many decades, I have talked to victims of crime who feel let down by the system. Victims who just don't see that openness and transparency. Victims who experience a system that sees rapists getting sentenced to 9 years in prison, but later automatically released after just half that time. Now, don't get me wrong. Some form of earlier release has its place in our criminal justice system. It can be used to incentivize good behaviour. But this is not the system we have, conference. There used to be a tougher system. But in 2005, Labour replaced it with automatic release at the halfway point. It didn't matter to Labour if prisoners pose a risk to the public. It didn't matter to Labour if prisoners misbehaved in prison. And it didn't matter to Labour if criminals didn't show remorse. This is madness. but the Conservatives are going to fix it. We're going to restore faith in the sentencing system because we Conservatives believe that release should be earned. Now, we have, of course, made great strides in criminal justice in the past 9 years of Conservative government, but there is more to be done. And that's why, for the most serious violent and sexual offenders, I'm announcing that this Conservative government will abolish automatic early release at the halfway point. These criminals will be required to serve 2/3 of their sentence behind bars, because keeping the most serious and dangerous violent and sexual offenders in prison for longer means that they won't be out on the streets with the opportunity to commit crime. We owe it to the victims to make this change. And just as it is right that criminals face proper punishment, it is also right that we do our very best to support them to go straight. We need to be tough, but we also need to be humane. Punishment and rehabilitation are not opposites. We have to do both. Now, Conservatives believe in offering a second chance to those who are ready to change, because prisons simply cannot be giant academies of crime. So, we will do more to improve rehabilitation in prison and support our probation services in their vital work to supervise and resettle former prisoners. And we will ask employers to play their part too. Conference, only the Conservatives can be trusted on law and order. Now, you may not have heard of Jeremy Corbyn's Shadow Justice Secretary, Richard Bergen, and you can be forgiven for that. He's not known for his brilliant ideas about criminal justice. Rather, he's better known for saying Zionism is the enemy of peace. And then he denied using these vile anti-Semitic words. But then video emerged. And then he admitted he actually did say it. Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell were two of only 3 MPs to vote against sending people caught carrying a knife to a second term of imprisonment. The fact is, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour is loose with the truth, soft on prisoners, and weak on sentencing. Soft on crime, and soft on the causes of crime. We cannot let that happen. We must keep the public safe. And that's why, with one of his very first acts, our Prime Minister announced that we will recruit 20,000 new police officers. More bobbies on the beat means more arrests, more victims getting justice. And an investment of £2.5 billion to deliver 10,000 new prison places. More and better prisons to support our brilliant prison officers, the unsung heroes who, day in and day out, face huge risks in their workplace. And to help them, we've announced £100 million for new security measures, such as the scanners at Her Majesty's Prison Leeds, checking people as they go in and out of our prisons. These scanners show us the ways drugs are smuggled in can often be creative. When we visited HMP Leeds, the Prime Minister wondered what exactly the small plastic container coming up on the body scanner was. I think we all had something of a Kinder surprise. The PM then wondered about how the small capsule had got to where it was. Now, there's always that moment with a new boss when you're not quite sure what you can and can't say. I did think about explaining, but I knew in my gut that it was a bad idea, much as the prisoner did. But more seriously, conference, prison is a hugely important tool to tackle crime, but it is not the only one. We must make use of smart technologies to prevent offenders from becoming re-offenders, because prison only works if it reduces re-offending. And we want former prisoners to be fully productive members of society, but they must abide by the law at all times when they're back on our streets. Many criminals who carry out antisocial behaviour have problems with alcohol. Get a grip on this, and we can massively reduce crime. When he was Mayor of London, the Prime Minister piloted putting sobriety tags on offenders. If criminals drink alcohol, they are instantly detected, brought in front of a judge, and may be sent to prison. The pilot was a huge success, with over 90% compliance. So, we're going to take that idea and establish it nationally. I'm pleased to announce, conference, that from next year, sobriety tags will be used across the country to monitor criminals and to reduce re-offending. Conference, in London today, I've been taking part in a ceremony that is almost as ancient as our criminal justice system itself. I know we must restore public faith in sentencing. We must be clear. Only criminals who earn their liberty should have it. We must keep Britain safe for everyone who lives here. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And as you heard, unfortunately, he couldn't be here in person today, but some big announcements there. Before we start to discuss that with the panel, I thought it might be quite interesting for everybody to hear a little bit about the actual people behind the titles here. So I wanted the panel to introduce themselves to you. So I thought I'll start ladies first, if that's all right, Lucy. Would you like to tell everybody your job? You are Minister for Prisons and Probation, but it covers a lot more. And just a quick couple of minutes so they get to know who Lucy Fraser QC is.
Absolutely, and it's a pleasure to be here in conference. I am the, as Katie said, the Prisons and Probation Minister. That obviously covers ensuring our prisons are safe and decent places to live and overseeing the very significant probation changes that we'll be making in the future. In addition, I deal with offender health, female offenders, as well as veterans and trans prisoners. And before I was appointed the Prisons Minister, I was Solicitor General, and before that I also held a role in the Ministry of Justice, responsible for courts, court reform, criminal law, family law, and before that I was a barrister. So I've spent quite a significant amount of time dealing with justice matters.
Steeped in it. Great, thank you. And Kit, turning to you, Kit Malthouse, you are Crime, Policing and Fire Minister.
I am,
I
Katie.
got it in the right
This time last year I was Housing Minister, but now I'm Crime, Policing and the Fire Service. Not new to it though. I spent 4 years at City Hall as Boris's Deputy Mayor for Policing, fighting crime in the capital between 2008 and 2012. And I've been asked to come and repeat the job. It's an old beat for me, but I'm very happy to be doing it. My job broadly, I guess, falls into 4 areas. First of all, critically fighting crime, helping PCCs like you and our brilliant PCCs, many of whom are here today, I know, on the front here, and our candidates, to drive performance on crime across the country, particularly difficult crime types, dealing with county lines, drug dealing, burglary, car crime, violence against women and girls, along with my colleague Victoria Atkins, who's trapped in Westminster today, looking at all those issues. That's the critical thing. Secondly, dealing with the health, welfare, rules, regulations around police officers, and indeed firefighters. They're incredible men and women who run towards danger every single day, who need to be cared for, treasured, cosseted, looked after, so they're in a great position to do the job and feel supported by us. Thirdly, the fire service is going through a big era of change, the advent of new technology, looking at what more they can do on prevention, driving fires down across the country. And then finally, the big job for you and me and all the police and crime commissioners will be recruiting those 20,000 new police officers, which is going to make an enormous difference over the next 36 months to fighting crime across the country.
Good, and we'll probably come on and chat about that in a minute.
Yeah.
So finally, the gentleman sitting next to me, and I know conference are going to give you a huge round of applause, is our newly selected prospective parliamentary candidate for Wakefield.
Thank you.
So this is
Thank you.
Anthony Calvert. So tell us, Anthony, a bit about you.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much, Katie, for the introduction, and thank you for coming along to this debate. Well, this is an incredibly important debate. It's great that we're talking about a lot of other things than the B word, but the B word is a big thing wherever we go. And in Wakefield, it is similarly so. We've got a 2,000 vote majority to overcome, and it will be great to see as many of you here today on the M1 or up on the Great North Eastern Rail, or whatever it is called these days, to come and help. But with the amazing transport links for Wakefield come huge problems and huge concerns. And Wakefield has, over the last 5 or 6 years that I've been the parliamentary candidate, I was there in 2015 and 2017, Wakefield has experienced a real decline in its town centre, in the way that the city operates. You may have heard the term broken windows. It is certainly something that we are seeing more and more, and a local authority, a Labour local authority, that is not getting to grips with it. So I'm very, very pleased to be here to be able to discuss some of these really important measures on ensuring that we can increase the police presence, increase the amount of activity in places like Wakefield to really start doing what I want to see Wakefield do, and that's be that amazing cathedral city that it should be.
So, thank you.
Thank
so
you.
as you can see, we've got 3 people very representative of sort of the start on the doorsteps and where the crime really happens and affects us all, through to policing and crime, and then to Lucy's at the other end of the prison bit, which brings us nicely back to Robert's speech. Obviously, a couple of big announcements there, but the one I wanted to talk about first was the ending of the automatic early release scheme. I mean, why are we doing this, Lucy?
As the Lord Chancellor said, it's really important that when a victim comes forward, that victim generally goes through quite a lot of pain in reporting their crime, reliving their crime through court, especially for some particular offences, sexual assault cases, rapes. They go through all that trauma. They have a court hearing, and then they get justice with a sentence at the end of it. And they're relieved, and they get the sentence. And let's say the sentence is a 10-year term, and they feel like justice is done. And I don't think the public appreciates, and those victims appreciate, that that offender is automatically going to be released after 5 years, not 10 years. So what we're doing and announcing today is ensuring that we have transparency and trust in our judicial process, that when sentences are handed down, people can have faith in the system, and people will get the punishment and justice that they deserve.
So I suppose the next question would be, why don't we keep them in for, if it's a 10-year sentence, why not keep them in the prison for the full 10 years? Why release them after 2/3, as is being proposed?
It's a very good question. But when I go into prisons, I see people who have been in there for a long time. And being in prison, you have a lot done for you. Sure. Hopefully it's with you and not to you, but you have a regime that operates. And people who are in for quite a long time need to learn how to get back into the community. They need to be rehabilitated. We have a lot of great programs in prisons in terms of improving people's mental health. We have great programs in terms of literacy and numeracy. A lot of prisoners, over 50%, have a very low reading age, about the age of 11. They haven't had jobs, they don't have skills. We need to ensure that these people have the skills to operate well on the outside, and we need a period of time to allow them to adapt to being in the community. So when they're released after the 2/3, they don't go straight back out into the community. They'll be on licence, and they'll be subject to a number of conditions. And the probation service will be managing them and making sure that they are safe to live in the communities, monitoring their activity, making sure they don't commit further crimes. And we need that period towards the end of the sentence to ensure that they can be released fully and independently back into the communities. And so that's an important period of time. And if they commit a further offence or they breach their conditions in that period, we have the ability to recall them back to prison, and then they will obviously serve their sentence there. But that is an important part of the sentence.
So a more phased approach. I don't think people realise that they would originally just get released and there was no risk assessment done at all. So out they would come and that would be it, no way of monitoring them at all. So I'm going to be a bit cheeky and ask you the next question. What's to stop judges from then just giving shorter sentences?
There's very, very clear sentencing guidelines. I, as Solicitor General, looked at them very regularly because as Solicitor General, I was responsible for the unduly lenient sentence scheme, seeing whether judges had got it right, people saying actually judges were having too lenient to sentences, and it's the Attorney General's office to review those and look at them again. So there's very clear sentencing guidelines as to what sort of tariff a judge should award. Those won't change. So we shouldn't see a reaction to this at all from judges. Those sentencing guidelines, which already exist, will continue to be followed by the judges.
Okay, that's reassuring to know, I think. So I've probably done enough of cheeky questions here. I won't get away with any more. So, Kit, turning to you. I mean, the other big announcement there from Robert was around the sobriety tags.
Yeah.
And I know you know probably a little bit about those.
Quite a lot. So this is today is a red letter day for me because it's the end of well, hopefully the start of a great result, but the end of 9 years of campaigning. 9 years ago, I was Deputy Mayor for Policing in London, looking for a solution to alcohol crime in the capital, which generates about 15 times as much violence as drugs do, actually. And I met an American criminologist who introduced me to what they call 24/7 sobriety in the States, which was just getting going in South Dakota. And it seemed to me like a really intuitively great thing to do. So I took it to the then Mayor of London, our now Prime Minister, who was keen on the idea, and we managed to campaign in Parliament with the help of some great parliamentarians. Michael Ellis helped us as a backbencher, Matthew Offord, then in the House of Lords, Anne Jenkin, who some of you might know, runs Women to Win, helped us get it onto the statute book, and we ran this fantastic pilot in Croydon, 90-odd% compliance, as Robert said, and it's been enormously successful. But since then, we've kind of pushing, hoping that it might be taken up across the rest of the country. So it's fantastic now that the Prime Minister is going to put, I think, 22 million behind it, roll it out across the rest of the nation. I think it will make an enormous difference because for community sentences and indeed for those people where alcohol is a significant part of their offending, who would otherwise go for a short sentence in prison, we know that by fitting this tag that effectively stops them drinking, they are much less likely, 90% less likely to offend. It also has an enormous success on reoffending, much less reoffending than other types of disposals. So we think there's enormous potential.
So how does the tag actually work?
So the tag fits on you somewhere, on your leg, and it tests your skin every 30 seconds for traces of alcohol. You know, you will know, Katie, if you've had a heavy night. You can tell the next morning, of course not. You could tell the next morning, but the alcohol comes out through the pores in your skin. The tag detects, and if it detects that you've been drinking, it sends a signal through the system, and then you will be called in to report, and you can be put in front of a magistrate and possibly go to prison or maybe start again on the testing regime. You know, the compliance is so high that we think there's enormous potential. And in some parts of the US, they are using it in other offence types, like domestic violence, where they've seen a similar fall. It was started as a thing for repeat drink driving, but now it's spreading across the whole US. And it's a really innovative way of doing something cheaply, efficiently, but highly effective from a crime point of view that keeps people broadly out of prison, but at the same time, you know, means that they're not offending.
So do you think that will happen on the, go down well on the doorsteps?
I certainly think it'll go down well on the doorsteps. I think in practice it will make a huge difference in places like Wakefield, and cheaply and efficiently rings plenty of bells with me as well. And what I suspect many people in this audience and those participating in the conference perhaps from home will recall from their own personal experiences is that you can go to a lot of these town centres, a lot of these city centres in provincial England, but and in my case up in the right side of the Pennines, up in West Yorkshire, and I'm not going to be able to get out now, am I? But we can see those potential those potential initiatives working very well. Just the other week, I was in Wakefield. We'd done a big campaign session. We're coming back to our offices, which are in a part of Wakefield where you go down, and it's very depressed. And it's very depressed economically for some very, very good or bad reasons. But one thing we did notice is that was a congregation of people who were very heavily addicted on many, many things, but clearly in that instance, even at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they were spaced out, and and there's a lot of people on alcohol as well. So those sort of things, those sort of initiatives, if we can employ those, if those can be brought into provincially, I think will make a real big difference.
So is this going to stop us locking people up in prison, though? I can hear people saying that. Or what sort of crimes is this going to be done for?
It could be an alternative of very short sentence, but if you know, magistrates often have a problem, which is if you get somebody who's done repeatedly for minor offences, Friday, Saturday night, a fray or a punch-up or whatever it might be, where normally they'd get community sentences, but then after 5 or 6, you have no choice but to put them inside. If you put them on the sobriety tag, we know at least the alcohol is being removed from the equation. And if they're on it for 3 or 6 months or whatever it might be, then we know they're much less likely to go back to alcohol in the future. Certainly evidence from the States that is the case. And of course, by staying, they keep their job, they stay in connection with their family, you don't get all the problems that you come with those very short sentences. So it's an alternative, as I say. It's been tried in Croydon. There's actually a pilot in Humberside, Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, ongoing at the moment. We think there's enormous potential for it to spread it across the country.
Yeah, I was talking to the Police and Crime Commissioner from Lincolnshire earlier, and he said it's gone down really well. Lots of good evidence there. And I know the Labour Police and Crime Commissioner as well in Humberside has said it's been very successful. So
and that's absolutely right. And one of the reasons why this is so important is that we know that 50% of violent crimes are committed by people who have an alcohol problem. So this is tackling a huge cohort in a very efficient way.
Yeah.
Good. Good, excellent. So I was just going to come on to Anthony now to say kind of you're knocking on doorsteps. This is your 3rd time as a...
3rd time lucky.
Yeah, 3rd time lucky. Good.
3rd time
That's what we like to hear. What sort of issues are you finding on the streets? What are people saying to you really matters? Obviously, we've heard alcohol.
Well, indeed, and I made the point earlier on, interjected about the usefulness of that particular initiative. And when you're knocking on doors in places like Wakefield, they are saying the same things over and over again, and that is that they are afraid, in many cases, to go to the city centre, that they are afraid to go and be involved in activities, both community activities, voluntary activities, within the cathedral area, which is a very, very good magnet in Wakefield, if you've ever been there. And that is because of some of the very, very great big problems that we're seeing. Violence against shopkeepers as well is something that I think has not been discussed as much as it should do, particularly these small shopkeepers who are suffering antisocial behaviour because of people who are... We've talked about alcohol, but one thing I'm very, very keen that we start to address is the problems of the county lines that you will all have heard about and read about, and it is becoming increasingly problematic in places like Wakefield. And actually, I went to the University of Lincoln. I know the Lincolnshire Police and Crime Commissioner very well, and it's a very big problem in parts of Lincolnshire as well.
So county lines, now let's not assume everybody understands what a county line is, Kit. Can you explain it?
Yeah, so county lines is effectively a drug dealing phenomenon. What happened is for many years we saw falls in drug consumption in this country. Heroin, crack cocaine were falling. But the industry, for want of a better word, did what every industry does, which is respond by producing a better product, cheaper, and finding imaginative ways to market it and distribute it. And so a county line is effectively telephone lines that are used to market drugs in smaller towns. I have Andover in my constituency, and county lines is a phenomenon there too. And then using young people who are trapped into a life of gangs and crime, often pulled in by drug addiction, being used to transport the drugs and deal them in those smaller towns outside the big metropolitan areas. Now, I've been given a strict instruction by the Mayor of London, not Mayor of London, there you are, Freudian slip now, Prime Minister, that county lines...
Mayor of London,
exactly,
it's the best one.
Always will be Mayor of London, that it has to be rolled up. He wants this phenomenon ended. You'll hear something from it about it from the Home Secretary later on. But in truth, there's lots that we can do, right? First of all, we have to get into the business model, right? This is a business that can be disrupted. Sure. As Conservatives, we spend quite a lot of our time making sure that government doesn't disrupt legitimate business, but government can be quite good at messing with business. So we should put them in on an illegitimate one and deal with the business model, make it hard to get around and really grip it. But secondly, we have to intervene in young people's lives. Yep. to turn them away, not just from county lines, but also away from violence generally, making sure that when that impulse, they feel an impulse in a situation of conflict occurs, that they don't reach for a knife, that they're not violent, you know, in a way that we weren't perhaps in the past. Young people do occasionally get into those conflicts, and it's making sure that we take the violence out of it that's key. And we can do that with lots of intervention. You know, yesterday the Chancellor announced a 500 million Youth Intervention Fund, fantastic now. You know, and I'm very keen to promote some of the stuff we did back in London around uniformed youth groups. You know, there's a lot of potential amongst cadets, scouts, guides, you know, all these organisations to instill in young people a sense of you know, respect, teamwork, how to deal with conflict, how to work together. Particularly police cadets, I'd like to see expanded across the country, a fantastic resource, as you know. So there's lots that we can do, both on enforcement, you know, more stop and search, taking more knives off the street, but at the same time making sure that young people are properly socialised and assisted at difficult points in their life to make the right choices.
Absolutely. So
I think that's really important. I was at a prison last week, HMP Thameside, and I met a young offender who'd come into prison. He was 19. He'd been carrying a knife. It was the first time he'd been in prison. And I don't think he realised what the consequences of his behaviour were. So we absolutely need to ensure that young people understand that there are alternatives, that they have choices, and that they can go down the right path, not the wrong one. But also that's we need to not just tackle drugs in county lines, we need to tackle drugs in prisons as well.
Well, I was going to come on to that. So certainly in my patch in Sussex, we have 2 prisons. And I know there have been and are continue to be issues there with drugs. So what's the Conservative plan around that, Lucy?
Well, the £100 million that the Lord Chancellor referred to, that the Prime Minister announced a few months ago, £100 million going into security in prisons. That will enable us to have airport-style security systems. You know, when you go through your scanner, as the Lord Chancellor referred to, you can detect things inside, like Kinder eggs, and they're really, really effective. I went to HMP Liverpool a few weeks ago. They don't have the scanner, but what they did was when prisoners had been released and then committed an offence and were recalled back to prison, instead of just taking them back into HMP Liverpool, where they don't have a scanner, they took them back to the neighbouring prison and they went through their scanner. And what the governor of Liverpool found was that 50% of people coming back to prison were bringing drugs back in. So these scanners will stop drugs coming back into prisons. And it's not just that. We need to deal with mobile technology. We need to stop people because they're doing crime on their mobile phones in prisons. So the scanners will help with that. Our technology to block mobile signals in prisons will help with that. So the £100 million that the Prime Minister announced a few months ago that we're working in the Ministry of Justice to spend is absolutely critical to stopping crime in prisons.
Sure. Absolutely.
And just coming back onto that as well, we've got in Wakefield, we've got one of the biggest prisons in the country. We've got HMP Wakefield, Category A prison, and of course, along with that comes the number of people who work there, who live in Wakefield and who rely very heavily on the government supporting them through additional security at work. And I think one thing that I'm very, very encouraged by, and one thing that certainly is going to play well in Wakefield with those people that, you know, I'm very concerned to represent, is making sure that they can work in that particular environment, in a safer environment, and that they can be more protected from those issues that you just raised. But just finishing the point on the drugs issue, if I may, because it really is something that that affects so many people, and it's worth pointing out. I think the Lord Chancellor made a very good point that that those who are users are the real victims, and the rehabilitation of those is so very important. Those who deal and peddle, they're peddling misery. They're the evil of society. And I'm really, really encouraged with the 10,000 additional prison spaces. And I'm very much hopeful that we can get into finding who those real bad uns are, take them out of society, and that will very much help the rest.
Yeah.
A lot of it stems from drug dealing.
And of course the uplift in police officers as well.
Precisely.
I mean, that must be ringing well on the doorsteps, because if the one thing the public tell me as a police and crime commissioner is they want to see more visible policing. They want the police back in their communities.
Yep, yeah, and not everybody can be like David Lammy, who has, problems with finding police. I'm certainly very encouraged that that's going to happen, because actually putting police in areas like parts of Wakefield and the bottom of the Springs around the Kirkgate area is going to make a material difference with cleaning up an area and making businesses more likely to want to invest in there.
So I've got a lot of my colleagues sitting in the audience there, Minister Kit. And obviously we really welcome this uplift in officers. It's great news, but we're quite keen to understand what that means, what that's going to look like. So did you want to sort of talk to us a bit more about it?
Yeah, the amount of money we've been given is fantastic. So we've got 45 million quid in year to start recruitment straight away, and 750 million from next year to keep us going through. During that period, we want to recruit 6,000 police officers, on top of the 3,000 that were already baked in from last year. All those 6,000 we've committed will be what we call territorial policing. So it's kind of out there in the streets doing the kind of reassurance, visibility work that you would expect. The allocation, I've learned, there's a great word they use in government that I've learned to use extensively, shortly. The allocation will be announced shortly, but I've no doubt the Home Secretary will have something to say about that this afternoon.
It's a bit like the words in the summer.
Yeah, in the summer, that's right, in the autumn, shortly. But any minute now.
Great. So I've got some questions coming in here from the audience, and I was just having a look to see which ones to ask and who to go to first. I mean, one of them here, obvious one, will the extra police numbers really make a difference?
Yeah, I think they will, because one of the conversations that I've been having with police and crime commissioners and with chief constables is that the 20,000 are coming with an ask. They're coming with some governmental asks around performance, not least around violence, particularly, murder, where we've seen numbers rising, sadly, over the last couple of years, lots of it driven by drugs, around acquisitive crime, burglary in particular, car theft, which is rising after many years of falling, rising again. Violence against women and girls, you've seen in the media recently, lots of controversy about rape and convictions and detection of rape. We want to see some movement on that too. So there's a conversation that needs to be had with the whole policing family about what the demand is, if you like, for these 20,000, because, policing numbers are important, but it's not just about numbers. When we last saw knife crime spiking in London, it was when we had police numbers at an all-time high. So it's very much about priority and what they're doing, and that's what we want to talk to PCCs about.
Good.
Can I just come in on that, Katie? Because there's a really important point about the fact that what this government has recognised, which is really important, is that you don't just look at one department. When you make a change in one department, there are consequential changes that you need to make in another. And I think what the Prime Minister has done is looked at the criminal justice as a whole. And so we've got 20,000 new police officers, but it doesn't stop there, because if you catch more criminals, you have to take them to court. So we've also seen an announcement of £85,000 for £85 million for the CPS. And we've seen, once we've caught them, they've gone through court, they've been prosecuted successfully, we've seen the investment into the prisons and security. And taking this holistic approach to government, I think, is really to be welcomed.
Yeah. I mean, one of the questions here, Kit, but I think you answered it, was what are we going to do about knife crime in London?
So look, we've got, just before we get there, Kate, we've got a whole row of PCCs here.
Yeah.
Calling out for investment in police.
Would you give them a round of applause, Tom?
Well, this is exactly what we're getting. So,
I don't know what you call a collective of police and crime commissioners.
PCCs.
Maybe a cell.
But just to reassure everybody, the investment that we're seeing in police numbers, the rise of 20,000, will be the biggest expansion of the police ever. It will be a huge rise, and people will feel it quite quickly on the streets. Apart from the pure numbers, we also have to make sure that we invest in police welfare and safety.
Yeah.
It's critical that officers feel that we're behind them, that we support them, that they have everything they need to keep themselves safe when we ask to put themselves in danger.
So what are we going to do?
Well, there's lots that we could... I don't want to preempt what the I'm going to say, but there's lots. both of us are committed to this idea of officer safety and welfare.
Yeah.
Right? It's a really tough job. It's a fantastic job being a police officer. We hope that lots and lots of people will apply for it. And we want to make sure that they feel supported and looked after as we move forward. So invest in the police, absolutely.
It's good to see. I mean, locally in Sussex, on average, we have 3 officers assaulted every day. Every day, just in my county. I think it's totally unacceptable.
It's true, and I think there's something about in our culture. One of the things, the phenomenon that's really alarmed me over the last few years is those videos you see online of people filming police officers grappling with and sort of not supporting, I don't necessarily assisting, particularly if it's a violent offender, but actually laughing, jeering, filming, and then posting for entertainment. Right? These are very, very traumatic and difficult situations for police officers when they're having to use their training and often physical, brute force to overcome a criminal. And at the very least, the public shouldn't just be standing by, they should be supporting them. We need to see an end to that culture and absolute support for the police in their job.
As Kit supports them, absolutely. I think that the police do an absolutely fundamental and important role. But I would also like to give a shout out to the prison officers. We're also going to need significant, if we have more police, we're catching more criminals, we're going to need more prison officers, and we're going to need more probation officers as well, both of whom who do fantastic jobs in prisons, in our communities, helping to turn people's lives around. And they also, we welcome any applications for those positions. They too need to be supported.
We're competing to recruit people, yeah.
So this is very close to my heart, and probably not a question, but more of a statement. Somebody's just said here, please introduce proper mandatory custodial sentences for anyone who attacks police officers, prison officers, or NHS and A&E staff. So,
well, emergency workers.
I love being in charge of the questions.
I would shout out as well for firefighters, who too often come under pressure too.
I agree. So,
and parliamentary candidates. Yeah, and parliamentary candidates.
Well, let's change it slightly. So, Lucy, do you think our prisons are safe enough? And what, if not, what can we do more to keep them safe? We've talked about that 100 million investment, but
prisons can always be safer. And so what we need to do is increase the security, which we are absolutely doing with the £100 million investment. You will remember we did a 10 prisons project, which came to an end in August. And what we saw with a little bit investment into leadership and some programs, investment into the source of security that I've mentioned, we saw reductions of over 50% in terms of drug taking, mandatory drug taking reduced by 50%, and we saw results of assaults on staff significantly reduced as well in some of those prisons. So we can always do more to make sure our prisons are safe, but we are doing quite a lot.
And I know you're really keen on rehabilitation as well, and I don't think we probably touched on it enough. Did you want to say any more around rehabilitation?
Rehabilitation is really important because everybody who comes out is going to go back into the community. So we need to turn those people's lives around. And we've set up a new futures network to try and get more people into employment. So any employers out there who want to recruit prison officers, offenders, we would really welcome that. We saw in the last session the fantastic company Tempus Novo, who are former prison officers who are trying to get people into work. But we also need to improve people's mental health. I was at a women's prison a couple of weeks ago, HMP Send, and there was a woman in there. She was on a life sentence. She'd been in there for 10 years, and she said she was coming up to her parole hearing. And she said, actually, I don't want to go out just yet, because they run a fantastic program in HMP Send called the Therapeutic Community, where they have immense amounts of mental health support. And she was in the middle of this program. And she said that the first time in her life, she felt supported, that she was on track, that she understood what she had done and how she was going to change. So that sort of work, which is going on in many of our prisons, turning people's lives around, is absolutely fundamental.
I mean, I thoroughly agree with that. I mean, one perhaps final point that I'd like to make on rehabilitation, and there's been a lot of discussion about it, and I think we need to have continuing discussions about that because it is very, very important. If people are coming out of prison and aren't properly rehabilitated, I mean, the disincentive for them to go back, to stay out into the community and stay within, if you like, functional society is far less. And you know, you and I and everybody around in this auditorium, you know, we're not going to break the law. We don't want a criminal record because it's going to affect our everyday lives. But of course, people who go out and haven't had that rehabilitation, it's a less of an incentive for them to do that.
And it creates a problem for the police. I mean, we have too many people who are effectively doing a life sentence in instalments. Why they're going in and out and in and out, and the police arresting them, it becomes a rigmarole. And that's the kind of system change that Lucy and I will be working on to try and, you know, break that cycle and get people onto the straight and narrow for good.
Yeah, I met a gentleman actually in a prison recently, and he was about to be released. And I always say to prisoners when I meet them, you know, did getting a custodial sentence make a difference? And, you know, how's your life going to change when you come out? And this particular gentleman said to me, absolutely getting a custodial sentence made a difference. If he had been given an order in the community, he wouldn't have stopped reoffending. So prison does work as a deterrence in that respect. But secondly, he said he too had been on a course in the prison. And he said, I recognise now I made the wrong choice. And I recognise that I can make better choices. And when I go out, I'm going to make better choices.
Brilliant. Good. So we've got less than a minute before the Home Secretary delivers her speech. And the panel don't know I'm going to ask this question. So this is where you see the beads of sweat appear on their brow. If you had one word to sum up your job at the moment, or why you want to be the MP for Wakefield, what would that one word be? Go on, Anthony. Passionate. We like that one.
You've got to be passionate to be in this, and it's very important.
Okay, good. Lucy.
Challenging but inspirational. The people I deal with are extremely inspiring.
I'm glad you're not a mathematician. I think that was more than one word.
I'm a politician.
Politician. Kit.
Grip.
We
It's time
like
to grip
that
crime.
one. We like that one. Good.
And by the way, can I just say, I don't want to lose this opportunity. Those of you who have relatives, nieces, nephews, brothers, sisters, sons, daughters, grandchildren, who want to be a police officer, we are hiring.
Yes.
And
Ladies and gentlemen.
Prison officers and probation officers.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the panel.
To us, law and order is not an election slogan. It is the foundation of the British tradition. The government is playing its full part in the fight against crime. We've strengthened the police. We've introduced tougher sentences.
We want to keep families, communities and our country safe. We want a better deal for the police and a worse deal for criminals.
Policing safe streets is the absolute bedrock of society. The public needs that confidence that comes with seeing, say, a neighbourhood team, a police officer out on the streets. My job is to make your streets safer. And we're going to go in with another 20,000 police on the streets, and we start recruiting forthwith.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Today, here in Manchester,
the Conservative Party takes its rightful place as the party of law and order in Britain once again. We stand with the brave men and women of our police and security services. And we stand against the criminals, the gangs, the drug barons, the thugs, the terrorists who seek to do us harm. And we say that proudly and without apology, as the party that has always backed the forces of law and order, and we always will. We ask them to do the most difficult of jobs. We ask them to put themselves in harm's way, to run towards danger, to ensure that we are not in danger. Being here in Manchester, it is impossible to forget that. Just over 2 years ago, this city was victim to one of the most sickening terror acts of our country has ever witnessed. Manchester truly experienced the worst of humanity that night, but also the best. That spineless coward was met with the heroism of our emergency workers and Britain's finest intelligence agencies. And as they face up to such danger, they need to know that they are not alone. They need to know that they have a Prime Minister, a Home Secretary, and a government that stands beside them. I am that Home Secretary. Boris Johnson is that Prime Minister. And the Conservative Party is that government. One of my first acts as Home Secretary was to start recruiting 20,000 new police officers, giving them the strength that they need in numbers, giving them new and immediate funding, and supporting and equipping them with the powers they need to keep us safe, including lifting restrictions on emergency stop and search powers for all forces across England and Wales. Giving police officers the confidence that they need to clamp down on violent crime. These are the police powers police chiefs tell me they need. Now, I've heard their voice, and I'm answering their call. And I want to tell you why. And there are 3 reasons. Firstly, because backing the forces of law and order is central to our DNA as Conservatives. Giving people the security they need to live their lives and live their lives as they choose is an essential part of our freedom. We recognise that freedom and security are not opposites, but equals, and that ensuring people can live their lives free from fear is the essential foundation for a life of liberty. Because the people posing the threats are ever more callous, and the job we ask the police to do is ever more difficult and dangerous. These are facts that I never forget. Almost every day, I pass the gates of the Houses of Parliament. There stands a memorial to PC Palmer, killed in the line of duty on the 22nd of March 2017 during a terror attack at the heart of our democracy. His sacrifice will never be forgotten. Around the corner from my office stands a National Police Memorial and a book containing the names of 4,000 men and women killed as they went about their work. Tragically, we must now add a new name to that proud roll of honour. PC Harper, a 28-year-old newlywed, senselessly and brutally killed in the line of duty on the 15th of August this year. He too will always be remembered. I will always remember visiting Thames Valley Police the day after he was killed. The shock and the sorrow was palpable, but the determination to come together, to carry on and continue the relentless pursuit of justice was inspiring. Their safety, their dedication, and their loyalty are what I think of every single day. The second reason we must back the police is to remove the grip gangs and organised criminals have on our communities. They just don't care who they hurt or abuse. The kingpins of these criminal gangs are exploiting children, forcing them to carry crack cocaine and heroin across rural and coastal communities, threatening them into carrying guns and knives as protection, manipulating them into killing innocent people. Faced with this new and growing danger, our police will know that I will back them to get this under control. And if there has been any doubt about that commitment in the past, let that end here today. Recruiting 20,000 police officers is just the start. I'm equipping police officers with the kit and the tools they need to protect themselves and others from harm. I have created a new fund to give police chiefs the ability to train and equip police officers with tasers. It is the job of chief constables to make that operational decision. It is the job of the Home Secretary to empower them to do so. I am giving them that power. And today, I'm announcing a £20 million package to roll up county lines drugs gangs, to stop them from terrorising our towns and our villages and exploiting our children. I'm also announcing a new £25 million Safer Streets Fund for new security measures for Britain's worst crime spots. And as well as giving the police the kit and the powers they need, we must do much more to recognise their commitment, their bravery, and their professionalism. I have been humbled by the officers I have met and the experiences that they have shared with me. This is why I have personally accelerated the work to establish the Police Covenant. This is a pledge to do more as a nation to help those who serve our country, to recognise the bravery, the commitment, and the sacrifices of serving and former officers. And we will enshrine this into law. We will also ensure that anyone who assaults a police officer receives a sentence that truly fits the crime, to make the thugs that would attack an officer think twice. That's what I mean by backing the police. And there's a third reason we must back our police. It is because this is what the people want and what they expect us to do. This is a government driven by the people's priorities. Hard-working, honest, law-abiding people whose needs are humble and whose expectations are modest and whose demands of their government are simple. They want us to listen. They ask us to respond. And they expect us to do what we say. From crime to immigration, to leaving the European Union, we are ready to listen and do what they want. It's called democracy. And that really shouldn't be a controversial statement. They are our masters, and we are their servants. Our job is to deliver on their priorities. But too many people are losing faith in politics and in politicians, and they're questioning the health of our democracy. Because over 3 years ago, the British public turned out to vote in their millions, and they knew what they were voting for. They were told the final result would be delivered. But their euphoria and optimism of that referendum day has given way to frustration and to anger. As a group of politicians, led by Jeremy Corbyn, think they know better and have done everything possible to stand in the way of democracy, ignoring the will of the people. I was proud to be part of that referendum campaign, a campaign that was electrified by one man who encouraged us to believe in a brighter Britain. And I'm proud to serve in his government as we work as a team and focus on getting Brexit done. And as Home Secretary, at this defining moment in our country's history, I have a particular responsibility when it comes to taking back control. It is to end the free movement of people once and for all. Instead, we will introduce an Australian-style points-based immigration system. One that works in the best interests of Britain, one that attracts and welcomes the brightest and the best, one that supports the brilliant scientists, the finest academics, and leading people in their fields, and one that is under the control of the British government. Because let me tell you something, this daughter of immigrants needs no lectures from the North London metropolitan liberal elite. That's what you get with a government that is driven by the people's priorities. And of course, there will be only two dissenting voices. You can work out who they are. Diane Abbott, Jeremy Corbyn, because the choice isn't who the people want to be our next Prime Minister. It's also about who the people want to be their next Home Secretary. Do we really want a Labour Home Secretary who would leave our communities and our country less safe? A Labour Party who wouldn't even attempt to take back control of our borders because they want to surrender our border control and extend free movement. And on policing, the Labour Party would stop the police from doing their job. And when it comes to our brilliant intelligence agencies, well, what can I say? The Labour Party trusts our foes more than our friends. To all of this, I say no, no, no. Only the Conservative Party is driven by the people's priorities, and that means backing our police, our country, and our communities. That pragmatic approach is grounded in the good sense of the British people. It keeps us focused on what matters today. That's the lesson I took from the very person who inspired me to join our party. A Conservative Prime Minister elected 40 years ago this year. Margaret Thatcher knew that if you... Margaret Thatcher knew that if you made the British people your compass, if you took time to understand their lives and priorities, then your direction would always be true. My policies, she said, are not based on some economic theory, but on things that I and millions like me were brought up with. An honest day's work for an honest day's pay. Live within your means, pay your bills on time, and support the police. That advice is as sound today as it was 40 years ago. Support the police, we will. This party, our Conservative Party, is backing those who put their lives on the line for our national security. So as we renew our place as the party of law and order in Britain, let the message go out from this hall today. To the British people, we hear you. To the police service, we back you. And to the criminals, I simply say this: we are coming after you. We stand for the forces of right and against the forces of evil. We stand for the law-abiding majority and not the criminal minority. We stand with those who seek to do right by themselves, their families and their communities. And we stand by Britain, ready to give the leadership our great country deserves. So as Conservatives, we must remind the public what we stand for. And as a party of the United Kingdom, we will get Brexit done and deliver on the people's priorities. Thank you. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Conservative Policy Forum begins in this auditorium at 4:30.